Chapter 9. The Seneschal's Advice. Straight across to the Palais Seneschal went Garnash, and sorely though his temper might already have been tried that day, tempestuously though it had been vented, there were fresh trials in store for him, fresh storms for Tresan. "May I ask, Monsieur le Seneschal," he demanded arrogantly, "to what end it was that you permitted yourself to order from its post the escort you had placed under my command?" "To what end?" returned the Seneschal, between sorrow and indignation. "Why, to the end that it might succor you if still in time. I had heard that if not dead already, you were in danger of your life." The answer was one that disarmed Garnash, in spite of his mistrust of Tresan, and followed as it now was by the Seneschal's profuse expressions of joy at seeing Garnash safe and well, it left him clearly unable to pursue the subject of his grievance in this particular connection. Instead, he passed on to entertain Tresan with the recital of the thing that had been done, and in reciting it his anger revived again, nor did the outward signs of sympathetic perturbation, which the Seneschal thought it judicious to display, do aught to mollify his feelings. "And now, monsieur," he concluded, "there remains but one course to be pursued, to return in force, and compel them at the sword point to surrender me mademoiselle. That accomplished, I shall arrest the dowager and her son, and every jackanapes within that castle. Her men can lie in Grenoble jail to be dealt with by yourself for supporting her in an attempt to resist the Queen's authority. Madame and her son shall go with me to Paris to answer there for their offense." The Seneschal looked grave. He thoughtfully combed his beard with his forefinger, and his little eyes peered a shade fearfully at Garnash through his horn-rimmed spectacles. Garnash had found him at his never-failing pretense of work. "Why, yes," he agreed, speaking slowly. "That way lies your duty. I rejoice, monsieur, to hear you say so, for I shall need your aid." "My aid?" The Seneschal's face assumed a startled look. "I shall require of you the necessary force to reduce that garrison." The Seneschal blew out his cheeks almost to bursting point, then wagged his head and smiled wistfully. "And where," he asked, "am I to find such a force? You have upwards of 10 score men in quarters at Grenoble. If I had those men, which I have not, what, think you, could they do against a fortress such as Condillac? Monsieur deludes himself. If they resist, you'll need 10 times that number to bring them to their senses. They are well victualled. They have an excellent water supply. My friend, they would just draw up the bridge and laugh at you and your soldiers from the ramparts." Garnash looked at him from under lowering brows, but for all his mistrust of the man, a mistrust most excellently founded, he was forced to confess that there was wisdom in what Tresan said. "I'll sit down and besiege them if need be," he announced. Again the Seneschal wagged his head. "You would have to be prepared to spend your winter there in that case, and it can be cold in the valley of Isère. Their garrison is small, some 20 men at most, but it is sufficient for their defense, and not too many mouths to feed. No, no, monsieur. If you will win your way by force, you must count upon more than 10 score men." And now a flash of inspiration helped Tresan. It was his aim, as we know, to run with the hare and hunt with the hounds. Break with Madame de Condillac his foolish, hopeful heart would not permit him. Break with this man, who personified authority in the king, he dared not. He had sought, and it had given him much to do, to steer a middle course, serving the dowager and appearing not to withstand the Parisian. Now it almost seemed to him as if he were come to an impasse beyond which he could no longer pursue that course, but must halt and declare his side. But the notion that now occurred to him helped him to win through this difficulty. For Madame de Condillac's schemes he cared not a jot. Whether they came safe to harbor or suffered shipwreck on the way was all one to him. Whether Valerie de la Vauvray married Marius de Condillac or the meanest cobbler in Grenoble was, similarly, a matter that never disturbed his mind. He would not even be concerned if he himself were to help the dowager's schemes of frustration, so long as she were to remain in ignorance of his defection, so long as outwardly he were to appear faithful to her interests. "Monsieur," said he gravely, "the only course that promises you success is to return to Paris, and, raising sufficient men, with guns and other modern siege appliances, such as we possess not here, come back and batter down the walls of Condillac." There the Seneschal spoke good sense. Garnash realized it. So much so that he almost began to doubt whether he had not done the man an injustice in believing him allied to the other party. But, however fully he might perceive the wisdom of the advice, Such a step was one that must wound his pride, must be an acknowledgment that his own resources, upon which the Queen had relied when she sent him single-handed to deal with the situation, had proved insufficient. He took a turn in the apartment without answering, tugging at his mustachios and pondering the situation, what time the seneschal furtively watched him in the candlelight. At last he came abruptly to a standstill by the seneschal's writing table, immediately opposite Tresan. His hand fell to his side. His eyes took on a look of determination. "As a last resource, your good advice may guide me, Monsieur le Seneschal," said he. "But first I'll see what can be done with such men as you have here." "But I have no men," answered Tresan, dismayed to see the failure of his effort. Garnash stared at him in an unbelief that was fast growing to suspicion. "No men," he echoed dully. "No men. I might muster a score, no more than that. But, monsieur, it is within my knowledge that you have at least 200. I saw at least some 50 drawn up in the courtyard below here yesterday morning." "I had them, monsieur," the seneschal made haste to cry, his hands upheld, his body leaning forward over his table. "I had them, but, unfortunately, certain disturbances in the neighborhood of Montelimar have forced me to part with them. They were on the point of setting out when you saw them." Garnash looked at him a moment, without speaking. Then, sharply, "They must be recalled, monsieur," said he. And now the seneschal took refuge in a fine pretense of indignation. "Recalled?" he cried, and besides indignation there was some horror in his voice. "Recalled? And for what?" "That they may assist you in obtaining charge of a wretched girl who is so headstrong as to wish to marry other than her guardians have determined. A pretty affair that, as God's my life. And for the adjustment of such a family dispute as this, a whole province is to go to ruin, a conflagration of rebellion is to spread unquenched? On my soul, sir, I begin to think that this mission of yours has served to turn your head. You begin to see it out of all proportion to its size. Monsieur, it may have turned my head or it may not, but I shall not be amazed if in the end it be the means of losing you yours. Tell me now, what is the disturbance you speak of in Montelimar?" That was a question all Tresan's ingenuity could not answer. "What affair is it of yours?" he demanded. "Are you Seneschal of Dauphiny, or am I? If I tell you that there is a disturbance, let that suffice. In quelling it, I do but attend to my own business. Do you attend to yours, which seems to be that of meddling in women's matters?" This was too much. There was such odious truth in it that the iron sank deep into Garnash's soul. The very reflection that such a business should indeed be his was of itself enough to put him in a rage, without having it cast in his teeth as Tresan had none too delicately done. He stormed and raged. He waved his arms and thumped the table, and talked of cutting men to ribbons, among which men, no doubt, he counted my lord the Seneschal of Dauphiny. But from a storm of fierce invective, of threats and promises with which he filled the air, the seneschal gathered with satisfaction the one clear statement that he would take his advice. "I'll do as you say," Garnash had ended. "I'll get me back to Paris as fast as horse can carry me. When I return, woe betide Condillac, and I shall send my emissaries into the district of Montelimar to inquire into these disturbances you tell of. Woe betide you if they find the country quiet. You shall pay a heavy price for having dispatched your soldiers thither to the end, that they might not be here to further the Queen's business." With that he caught up his rain-sodden hat, flung it on his head, and stalked out of the room, and so, out of the palace. He left Grenoble next morning, and it was a very tame and crestfallen Garnash who quitted the Auberge du Vauquetet and rode out of the town to take the road to Paris. How they would laugh at him at the Luxembourg! Not even an affair of this kind was he fit to carry through. Not even as a meddler in women's matters, as Tresan had called him, could he achieve success. Rebecque, reflecting his master's mood, as becomes a good lackey, rode silent and gloomy a pace or two in the rear. By noon they had reached Voiron, and here, at a quiet hostelry, they descended to pause a while for rest and refreshment. It was a chill, blustering day, and although the rain held off, the heavens were black with the promise of more to come. There was a fire burning in the general room of the hostelry, and Garnash went to warm him at its cheerful blaze. Moodily he stood there, one hand on the high mantel shelf, one foot upon an andiron, his eyes upon the flames. He was disconsolately considering his position, considering how utterly, how irrevocably he had failed. Pondering the jibes he would have a stomach on his return to Paris, the ridicule it would income him to live down. It had been a fine thing to breathe fire and blood and vengeance to trace in yesterday, to tell him of the great deeds he would perform on his return. It was odds he never would return. They would send another in his place, if indeed they sent at all. For, after all, before he could reach Paris and the force required be in Dauphiny, a fortnight must elapse. Let them travel never so quickly. By that time, they must be singularly sluggish at Condillac, if they did not so contrive that no aid that came should come in time for Mademoiselle. Now that they were warned that the Queen was stirring in the matter. Oh! He had blundered it all most cursedly. Had he but kept his temper yesterday at Grenoble, had he but had the wit to thwart their plans, by preserving an unruffled front to insult, he might have won through and carried Mademoiselle out of their hands. As it was, he let his arms fall to his sides in his miserable despair. "Your wine, monsieur," said Rebecca at his elbow. He turned and took the cup of mulled drink from his servant. The beverage warmed him in body, but it would need a butt of it to thaw the misery from his soul. "Rebecca," he said with pathetic grimness, "I think I am the most cursed blunderer that ever was entrusted with an errand." The thing so obsessed his mind that he must speak of it. It'd be only to his lackey. Rebecca's sharp face assumed a chastened look. He sighed most dutifully. He sought for words of consolation. At least, monsieur has made them fear him up there at Condillac, said he. "Fear me?" laughed Garnache. "Pish! Deride me, you would say. Fear you, I repeat, monsieur. Else why are they at such pains to strengthen the garrison?" He questioned, but his tone was not greatly interested. "Are they doing that? Are they strengthening it? How know you?" "I had it from the ostler at the Vaux Cotet that a certain Captain Fortunio, an Italian soldier of fortune, who commands the men at Condillac, was at the Auberge de France last night, offering wine to whomsoever would drink with him, and paying for it out of Madame la Marquise's purse. To such as accepted his hospitality, he talked of the glory of a military career, particularly a freelance, and to those who showed interest in what he said, he offered a pike in his company. Enrolled he many, did you learn?" "Not one, monsieur. The ostler told me, and it seems he spent the evening watching him weave a spider's web. But the flies were over-wary. They knew whence he came. They knew the business for which he desired to enroll them. For a rumor had gone round that Condillac was in rebellion against the Queen's commands, and there were none so desperate at the Auberge of France as to risk their necks by enlisting, no matter what the wage he offered." Garnache shrugged his shoulders. "No matter," said he. "Give me another cup of wine." But as Rebecca turned away to obey him, there came a sudden gleam into the eye of Monsieur de Garnache, which lightened the depression of his countenance. Chapter 10. The Recruit. In the great hall of the Chateau de Condillac sat the Dowager, her son, and the Lord Seneschal in conference. It was early in the afternoon of the last Thursday in October, exactly a week since Monsieur de Garnache, all but broken-hearted at the failure of his mission, had departed from Grenoble. They had dined, and the table was still strewn with vessels and the fragments of their meal, for the cloth had not yet been raised. But the three of them had left the board. The Seneschal with all that reluctance with which he was wont to part company with the table, no matter how perturbed in spirit he might be, and they had come to group themselves about the great open fireplace. A shaft of pale October sunshine entering through the gules and the scutcheon on the mullioned windows struck a scarlet light into silver and glass upon the forsaken board. Madame was speaking. She was repeating words that she had uttered at least 20 times a day during the past week. It was a madness to let that fellow go. Had we but put him and his servant out of the way, we should be able now to sleep tranquil in our beds. I know their ways at court. They might have marveled a little at first that he should tarry so long upon his errand, that he should send them no word of its progress. But presently, seeing him no more, he would little by little have been forgotten, and with him the affair in which the Queen has been so cursedly ready to meddle. As it is, the fellow will go back hot with the outrage put upon him. There will be some fine talk of it in Paris. It will be spoken of as treason, as defiance of the King's majesty, as rebellion. The Parliament may be moved to make outlaws of us. And the end of it all, who shall foresee? "It is a long distance from Condillac to Paris, madam," said her son with a shrug. "And you will find them none so ready to send soldiers all this way, Marquise," the Seneschal comforted her. "Bah! You make too sure of your security. You make too sure of what they will do, what leave undone. Time will show, my friends. And more, I am much at fault if you come not both to echo my regret that we did not dispose of Monsieur de Garnache and his lackey when we had them in our power. Her eye fell with sinister promise upon Tresan, who shivered slightly and spread his hands to the blaze, as though his shiver had been of cold. But Marius did not so readily grow afraid. "Madam," he said, "at the worst we can shut our gates and fling defiance at them. We are well manned, and Fortunio is seeking fresh recruits." "Seeking them, yes," she sneered. "For a week has the fellow been spending money like water, addling the brains of half Grenoble with the best wine at the auberges de France. Yet not a single recruit has come in, so far." Marius laughed. "Your pessimism leads you into rash conclusions," he cried. "You are wrong. One recruit has come in." "One," she echoed. 1,000 devils. A brave number that. A fine return for the river of wine with which we have washed the stomachs of Grenoble. Still, it is a beginning, ventured the seneschal. "Aye, and no doubt an ending," she flashed back at him. "And what manner of fool may this one be, whose fortunes were so desperate that he'd throw them in with ours? He is an Italian. A Piedmontese who was tramped across Savoy and was on his way to Paris to make his fortune, when Fortunio caught him and made it clear to him that his fortune was made for him at Condillac. He is a lusty, stalwart fellow, speaking no word of French, who was drawn Fortunio by discovering in him a fellow countryman." Mockery flashed from the dowager's beautiful eyes. "In that you have the reason of his enrolling himself. He knew no word of French, poor devil, so could not learn how rash his venture was. Could we find more such men, as this one might be well. But where shall we find them? Pish! My dear Marius, matters a little mended, nor ever will be, for the mistake we made in allowing Garnache to go his ways." "Madam," again ventured Tresan, "I think that you want for hopefulness." "At least, I do not want for courage, Monsieur le Comte," she answered him. "And I promise you that while I live, to handle a sword if need be, no Paris men shall set foot in Condillac." "Aye," grumbled Marius, "you can contemplate that, and it is all you do contemplate. You will not see, madam, that our position is far from desperate, that, after all, there may be no need to resist the king. It is 3 months since we had news of Florimond. Much may happen in 3 months when a man is warring. It may well be that he is dead." "I wish I knew he was, and damned," she snapped, with a tightening of her scarlet lips. "Yes," agreed Marius, with a sigh, "that were an end to all our troubles. I'm none so sure. There's still Mademoiselle, with her new-formed friends in Paris. May a pestilence blight them all. There's still the lands of La Vauvray to lose. The only true end to our troubles, as they stand at present, lies in your marrying this headstrong baggage. That the step should be rendered impossible, you can but blame yourself," Marius reminded her. "How so?" she cried, turning sharply upon him. "Had you kept friend with the church, had you paid tithes and saved us from this cursed interdict, we should have no difficulty in getting hither a priest, and settling the matter out of hand, be Valerie willing or not." She looked at him, scorn kindling in her glance. Then she swung round to appeal to Tresan. "You hear him, Count," said she. "There is a lover for you. He would wed his mistress whether she love him or not, and he has sworn to me that he loves the girl. How else should the thing be done since she opposes it?" asked Marius, sulkily. "How else? Do you ask me how else? God, were I a man, and had I your shape and face, there is no woman in the world should withstand me if I set my heart on her. It is address you lack. You are clumsy as a lout where a woman is concerned. Were I in your place, I had taken her by storm 3 months ago, when first she came to us. I had carried her out of Condillac, out of France, over the border into Savoy, where there are no interdicts to plague you, and there I would have married her." Marius frowned darkly, but before he could speak, Tresan was insinuating a compliment to the Marquise. "True, Marius," he said, with pursed lips. "Nature has been very good to you in that she has made you the very counterpart of your lady mother. You are as comely a gentleman as is to be found in France, or out of it." "Pish!" snapped Marius, too angered by the reflection cast upon his address to be flattered by their praises of his beauty. "It is an easy thing to talk, an easy thing to set up arguments when we consider but the half of a question. You forget, madam, that Valerie is betrothed to Florimond and that she clings faithfully to her betrothal. Virtude, swore the Marquise. And what is this betrothal? What this faithfulness? She has not seen her betrothed for 3 years. She was a child at the time of their fiancales. Think your faithfulness to him is the constancy of a woman to her lover? Go your ways, you foolish boy. It is but the constancy to a word, to the wishes of her father. Think you constancy that is no other base than that would stand between her and any man who, as you might do, had you the address, could make her love him? I do say so, answered Marius firmly. She smiled the pitying smile of one equipped with superior knowledge when confronted with an obstinate, uninformed mind. There's a droll arrogance about you, Marius, she told him quietly. You, a fledgling, would teach me, a woman, the ways of a woman's heart. It is a thing you may live to regret. As how? He asked. Once already has Mademoiselle contrived to corrupt one of our men and send into Paris with a letter. Out of that has sprung our present trouble. Another time she may do better, when she shall have bribed another to assist her to escape. When she herself shall have made off to the shelter of the Queen Mother, perhaps you will regret that my counsel should have fallen upon barren ground. It is to prevent any such attempt that we have placed her under guard, said he. You are forgetting that. Forgetting it? Not I. But what assurance have you that she will not bribe her guard? Marius laughed, rose, and pushed back his chair. Madam, said he, you are back at your contemplation of the worst side of this affair. You are persisting in considering only how we may be thwarted. But set your mind at rest. Gillis is her sentinel. Every night he sleeps in her anteroom. He is Fortunio's most trusted man. She will not corrupt him. The dowager smiled pensively, her eyes upon the fire. Suddenly she raised them to his face. Berthaud was none the less trusted. Yet, with no more than a promise of reward at some future time should she succeed in escaping from us, did she bribe him to carry her letter to the Queen. What happened to Berthaud that may not happen to Gillis? You might change your sentry nightly, put in the seneschal. Yes, if we knew whom we could trust, who would be above corruption. As it is, she shrugged her shoulders. That would be but to afford her opportunities to bribe them one by one until they were all ready to act in concert. Why need she any sentinel at all? Asked Traysen, with some show of sense. To ward off possible traitors, she told him, and Marius smiled and wagged his head. Madame is never done for seeing the worst, monsieur, which shows my wisdom. The men in our garrison are mercenaries, all attached to us only because we pay them. They all know who she is and what her wealth. Pity you are not a man who is deaf and dumb, said Traysen, half in jest. But Marius looked up suddenly, his eyes serious. We have as good, said he. There is the Italian knave Fortunio enrolled yesterday. As I have told you, he knows neither her wealth nor her identity. Nor if he did could he enter into traffic with her, for he knows no French, and she no Italian. The dowager clapped her hands. The very man, she cried. But Marius, either from sheer perverseness or because he did not share her enthusiasm, made answer. I have faith in Gillis. Yes, she mocked him, and you had faith in Berthaud. Oh, if you have faith in Gillis, let him remain. Let no more be said. The obstinate boy took her advice and shifted the subject, speaking to Traysen of some trivial business connected with the seneschalship. But Madame, womanlike, returned to the matter whose abandoning she had herself suggested. Marius, for all his affected disdain of it, viewed it with a certain respect. And so, in the end, they sent for the recruit. Fortunio, who was no other than the man Garnash had known as Sanguinetti, brought him, still clad in the clothes in which he had come. He was a tall, limber fellow, with a very swarthy skin and black, oily-looking hair that fell in short ringlets about his ears and neck, and a black, drooping mustache which gave him a rather hangdog look. There was a thick stubble of beard of several days' growth about his chin and face. His eyes were furtive in their glances, but of a deep blue that contrasted oddly with his blackness when he momentarily raised them. He wore a tattered jerkin, and his legs, in default of stockings, were swathed in soiled bandages and cross-gartered from ankle to knee. He stood in a pair of wooden shoes, from one of which peeped forth some wisps of straw, introduced, no doubt, to make the footgear fit. He slouched and shuffled in his walk, and he was unspeakably dirty. Nevertheless, he was girt with sword and a ragged scabbard hanging from a frayed and shabby belt of leather. Madame scanned him with interest. The fastidious Marius eyed him with disgust. The seneschal peered at him curiously through short-sighted eyes. "I do not think I have ever seen a dirtier ruffian," said he. "I like his nose," said Madame quietly. "It is the nose of an intrepid man." "It reminds me of Garnache's," laughed the seneschal. "You flatter the Parisian," commented Marius. The mercenary, meanwhile, stood blandly smiling at the party, showing at least a fine array of teeth and wearing the patient, attentive air of one who realizes himself to be under discussion, yet does not understand what is being said. "A countryman of yours, Fortunio?" sneered Marius. The captain, whose open, ingenuous countenance dissembled as villainous a heart as ever beat in the breast of any man, disowned the compatriotism with a smile. "Hardly, monsieur," said he. "Battista is a Piedmontese. Fortunio himself was a Venetian. Is he to be relied upon, think you?" asked Madame. Fortunio shrugged his shoulders and spread his hands. It was not his habit to trust any man inordinately. "He is an old soldier," said he. "He has trailed a pike in the Neapolitan Wars. I have cross-questioned him, and found his answers bore out the truth of what he said." "And what brings him to France?" asked Tresan. The captain smiled again, and there came again that expressive shrug of his. "A little over-ready with the steel," said he. They told Fortunio that they proposed to place him sentry over Mademoiselle instead of Gillis, as the Italian's absolute lack of French would ensure against corruption. The captain readily agreed with them. It would be a wise step. The Italian fingered his tattered hat, his eyes on the ground. Suddenly Madame spoke to him. She asked him for some account of himself and whence he came, using the Italian tongue, of which she had a passing knowledge. He followed her questions very attentively, at times with apparent difficulty, his eyes on her face, his head craned a little forward. Now and then Fortunio had intervened, to make plainer to this ignorant Piedmontese mind the Marquise's questions. His answers came in a deep, hoarse voice, slurred by the accent of Piedmont, and Madame, her knowledge of Italian being imperfect, had frequently to have recourse to Fortunio to discover the meaning of what he said. At last she dismissed the pair of them, bidding the captain see that he was washed and more fittingly clothed. An hour later, after the seneschal had taken his departure to ride home to Grenoble, it was Madame herself, accompanied by Marius and Fortunio, who conducted Battista, such was the name the Italian had given, to the apartments above, where Mademoiselle was now confined practically a prisoner. Chapter 11. Valerie's Jailer. "My child," said the dowager, and her eyes dwelt on Valerie with a look of studied gentleness, "why will you not be reasonable?" The constant reflection that Garnache was at large, making his way back to Paris to stir up vengeance for the outrage put upon him, was not without a certain chastening effect upon the dowager. She had a way of saying that she had as good a stomach for a fight as any man in France, and a fight there should be if it came to it, and Garnache should return to assail Condillac. Yet a certain pondering of the consequences, a certain counting of the cost, ordinarily unusual to her nature, led her to have recourse to persuasion, and to a gentleness no less unusual. Valerie's eyes were raised to hers with a look that held more scorn than wonder. They were standing in the antechamber of Valerie's room. Yonder at his post lounged the recruit Battista, looking a trifle cleaner than when first he had been presented to Marquise, but still not clean enough for a lady's antechamber. He was leaning stolidly against the sill of the window, his eyes on the distant waters of the Isère, which shone a dull copper color in the afterglow of the October sunset. His face was vacant, his eyes pensive, as he stood there undisturbed by the flow of a language he did not understand. Fortunio and Marius had departed, and the Marquise, played upon by her unusual tremors, had remained behind for a last word with the obstinate girl. "In what, madam," asked Valerie, "does my conduct fall short of reasonableness?" The dowager made a movement of impatience. If at every step she were to be confronted by these questions, which had in them a savor of challenge, she was wasting time in remaining. "You are unreasonable in this foolish clinging to a promise given for you." "Given by me, madam," the girl amended, knowing well to what promise the dowager referred. "Given by you, then, but given at an age when you could not understand the nature of it. They had no right to bind you so." If it is for any to question that right, it is for me, Valerie made answer, her eyes ever meeting the dowager's unflinchingly. And I am content to leave that right unquestioned. I am content to fill the promise given. In honor I cannot do less. Ah, in honor, the dowager sighed. Then she came a step nearer, and her face grew sweetly wistful. But your heart, child, what of your heart? My heart concerns myself. I am the betrothed of Florimond. That is all that concerns the world and you. I respect and admire him more than any living man, and I shall be proud to become his wife when he returns. As his wife, I shall become in spite of all that you and your son may do. The dowager laughed softly, as if to herself. And if I tell you that Florimond is dead, when you give me proof of that, I shall believe it, the girl replied. The marquise looked at her face manifesting no offense at the almost insulting words. And if I were laid at proof before you? She inquired, sadly almost. Valerie's eyes opened a trifle wider, as if in apprehension, but her answer was prompt and her voice steady. It still could have no effect upon my attitude towards your son. This is foolishness, Valerie. In you it is, madam, the girl broke in. A foolishness to think you can constrain a girl, compel her affections, command her love, by such means as you have employed towards me. You think that it predisposes me to be wooed, that it opens my heart to your son, to see myself jailed that he may pay me his court. Jailed, child? Who jails you? The dowager cried, as if the most surprising utterance had fallen from Valerie's lips. Mademoiselle smiled in sorrow and some scorn. Am I not jailed, then? She asked. What call you this? What is that fellow there? He is to lie outside my door at nights to see that none holds communication with me. He is to go with me each morning to the garden, when, by your gracious charity, I take the air. Sleeping and waking the man is ever within hearing of any word that I may utter. But he has no French, the dowager protested, to ensure no doubt, against any attempt of mine to win him to my side, to induce him to aid me escape from this prison. Oh, madam, I tell you, you do but waste time, and you punish me and harass yourself to little purpose. Had Marius been such a man as I might have felt in my nature to love, which heaven forbid, these means by which you have sought to bring that thing about could but have resulted in making me hate him as I do. The dowager's fears were banished from her mind at that, and with them went all thought of conciliating Valerie. Anger gleamed in her eyes. The set of her lips grew suddenly sneering and cruel, so that the beauty of her face but served to render it hateful the more. So that you hate him, Mamie? A ripple of mockery on the current of her voice. And he a man such as any girl in France might be proud to wed. Well, you are not to be constrained, you say. And the marquise's laugh was menacing and unpleasant. Be not so sure, mademoiselle. Be not so sure of that. It may well betide that you shall come to beg upon your knees for this alliance with a man whom you tell me that you hate. Be not so sure you cannot be constrained. Their eyes met. Both women were white to the lips, but it was curbed passion in the one and deadly fear in the other. For what the dowager's words left unsaid her eyes most eloquently conveyed. The girl shrank back, her hands clenched, her lip caught in her teeth. There is a God in heaven, madam, she reminded the marquise. Aye, in heaven, laughed the marquise, turning to depart. She paused by the door, which the Italian had sprung forward to open for her. Marius shall take the air with you in the morning, if it is fine. Ponder meanwhile what I have said. Does this man remain here, madam? Inquired the girl, vainly seeking to render her voice steady. In the outer anteroom is his place. But as the key of this room is on the side of the door, he may enter here when he so pleases, or when he thinks that he has reason to. If the sight of him displeases you, you may lock yourself from it in your own chamber yonder. The same she said in Italian to man, who bowed impassively, and followed the dowager into the outer room, closing the door upon mademoiselle. It was a chamber almost bare of furniture, save for a table and chair which had been placed there, so that the jailer might take his meals. The man followed the marquise across the bare floor, their steps resounding as they went, and he held the outer door for her. Without another word she left him, and where he stood, he could hear her steps as she tripped down the winding staircase of stone. At last the door of the courtyard closed with a bang, and the grating of a key announced the mercenary that he and his charge were both imprisoned in that tower of the Chateau de Condillac, left alone in the anteroom. Mademoiselle crossed the window and dropped limply into a chair. Her face was still very white, her heart beating tumultuously, for the horrid threat that had been conveyed in the dowager's words had brought her first thrill of real fear since the beginning of this wooing by force 3 months ago, a wooing which had become more insistent and less like a wooing day by day, until it culminated in her present helpless position. She was a strong-souled, high-spirited girl, but tonight hope seemed extinguished in her breast. Florimond, too, seemed to have abandoned her. Either he had forgotten her, or he was dead, as the dowager said, which might be the true state of things. She did not greatly care. The realization of how utterly she was in the power of Madame de Condillac and her son, and the sudden chance discovery of how unscrupulously that power might be wielded, filled her mind to the exclusion of all else. By the window she sat, watching, without heeding them, the fading colors in the sky. She was abandoned to these monsters, and it seemed they would devour her. She could hope for no help from outside, since they had, as she believed, slain Monsieur de Garnache. Her mind dwelt for a moment on that glimpse of rescue that had been hers a week ago, upon the few hours of liberty which she had enjoyed, but which only seemed now to increase the dark hopelessness of her imprisonment. Again, with the eyes of her mind, she beheld that grim, stalwart figure, saw his great nose, his graying hair, his fierce mustachios, and his stern, quick eyes. Again she heard the rasp of his metallic voice with its brisk derision. She saw him in the hall below, his foot upon the neck of that popinjay of Condillac, daring them all to draw a breath. Should he forbid it? Again in fancy she rode on the withers of his horse at the gallop toward Grenoble. A sigh escaped her. Surely that was the first man who was indeed a man she had ever set eyes on since her father died. Had Garnache been spared, she would have felt courage, and she would have hoped, for there was something about him that suggested energy and resource such as it is good to lean upon in times of stress. Again she heard that brisk, metallic voice. "Are you content, madam? Have you had fine deeds enough for one day?" And then, breaking in upon her musings, came the very voice of her daydream, so suddenly, sounding so natural and lifelike that she almost screamed, so startled was she. "Mademoiselle," it said, "I beg that you'll not utterly lose heart. I have come back to the thing Her Majesty bade me do, and I'll do it in spite of that tigress and her cub." She sat still as a statue, scarce breathing, her eyes fixed upon the violet sky. The voice had ceased, but still she sat on. Then it was slowly borne upon her that was no dream voice, no trick of her overburdened mind. A voice, a living, actual voice had uttered those words in this room, here at her elbow. She turned, and again she almost screamed, for there, just behind her, his glittering eyes fixed upon her with singular intentness, stood the swarthy, black-haired Italian jailer they had given her because he had no French. He had come up so quietly behind her that she had not heard his approach, and he was leaning forward now, with an odd suggestion of crouching in his attitude, like a beast about to spring. Yet his gaze riveted hers as with a fascination. And so, while she looked, his lips moved, and from them, in that same voice of her dreams, came from this man who had no French, the words, "Be not afraid, mademoiselle. I am that blunderer, Garnache, that unworthy fool whose temper ruined what chance of saving you he had a week ago." She stared like one going mad. "Garnache," said she in a husky whisper. "You Garnache." Yet the voice, she knew, was Garnache's and none other. It was a voice not easily mistaken. And now, as she looked and looked, she saw that the man's nose was Garnache's, though oddly stained, and those keen eyes, they were Garnache's too. But the hair that had been brown and flecked with gray was black. The reddish mustachios that had bristled like a mountain cat's were black, too, and they hung limp and hid from sight the fine lines of his mouth. A hideous stubble of unshorn beard defaced his chin and face, and altered its sharp outline. And the clear, healthy skin that she remembered was now a dirty brown. Suddenly the face smiled, and it was a smile that reassured her and drove away the last doubt that she had. She was on her feet in an instant. "Monsieur, monsieur," was all that she could say, but her longing was to fling her arms about the neck of this man, as she might have flung them about the neck of a brother or a father, and sob out upon his shoulder the sudden relief and revulsion that his presence brought. Garnache saw something of her agitation, and to relieve it he smiled and began to tell her the circumstances of his return and his presentation to Madame as a knave who had no French. Fortune was very good to me, mademoiselle, said he. I had little hope that such a face as mine could be disguised, but I take no pride in what you see. It is the handiwork of Rebecca, the most ingenious lackey that ever served a foolish master. It helped me that having been 10 years in Italy when I was younger, I acquired a language so well as to be able to impose even upon Fortunio. In that lay a circumstance which at once disarmed suspicion, and if I stay not so long as it shall take the dye to wear from my hair and beard, and the staining from my face, I shall have little to fear. But, monsieur, she cried, you have everything to fear. An alarm grew in her eyes, but he laughed again for answer. I have faith in my luck, mademoiselle, and I think I am on the tide of it at present. I little hoped when I made my way into Condillac in this array that I should end, by virtue of my pretended ignorance of French, in being appointed jailer to you. I had some ado to keep the joy from my eyes when I heard them planning it. It is a thing that has made all else easy. But what can you do alone, monsieur? She asked him, and there was a note almost of petulance in her voice. He moved to the window and leaned his elbow on the sill. The light was fast fading. I know not yet, but I am here to contrive a means. I shall think and watch. You know in what hourly peril I am placed, she cried, and suddenly remembering that he must have overheard and understood the dowager's words, a sudden heat came to her cheeks to recede again and leave them marble pale. And she thanked heaven that in the dusk and in the shadow where she stood, he could but ill make out her face. If you think that I have been rash in returning. No, not rash, monsieur, noble and brave above all praise. I would indeed I could tell you how noble and brave I account your action. It is as nothing to the bravery required to let Rebecca do this hideous work upon a face for which I have ever entertained some measure of respect. He jested, sooner than enlighten her that it was his egregious pride had fetched him back when he was but a few hours upon his journey Paris-wards, his inability to brook the ridicule that would be his when he announced at the Luxembourg that failure had attended him. Ah, but what can you do alone? She repeated. Give me at least a day or two to devise some means. Let me look round and take the measure of this jail. Some way there must be. I have not come so far, and so successfully, to be beaten now. Still, he continued, if you think that I overrate my strength or my resource, if you would sooner that I sought men and made an assault upon Condillac, endeavoring to carry it, and let the queens who prevail by force of arms tell me so, and I am gone tomorrow. Whither would you go? She cried, her voice strained with sudden affright. I might seek help at Lyons or Moulins. I might find loyal soldiers who would be willing to follow me by virtue of my warrant to levy such help as I may require. If I but tell them that the help was refused me in Grenoble, I am not sure that it would be so, for unfortunately, my warrant is for the Seneschal of Dauphiny only. Still, I might make the attempt. No, she implored him, and in her eagerness to have him put all thought of leaving her from his mind, she caught him by the arm and raised a pleading face to his. Do not leave me here, monsieur. Of your pity, do not leave me alone amongst them. Think me a coward if you will, monsieur. I am no less. They have made a coward of me. He understood the things she dreaded, and a great pity welled up from his generous heart for this poor, unfriended girl at the mercy of the beautiful, which of Condillac and her beautiful, rascally son. He patted the hand that clutched his arm. I think myself that it will be best if I remain, now that I have come so far, he said. Let me ponder things. It may well be that I shall devise some way. May heaven inspire you, monsieur. I shall spend the night in prayer, I think, imploring God and his saints to show you the way you seek. Heaven, I think, should hear your prayers, mademoiselle, he answered musingly, his glance upon the white, saintly face that seemed to shine in the deepening gloom. Then, suddenly he stirred and bent to listen. Someone is coming, he whispered, and he sped quickly from her side and into the outer room, where he sank noiselessly onto his chair as the steps ascended the stone staircase, and a glow of yellow light grew gradually in the doorway that opened onto it. Chapter 12. A matter of conscience. That he might inspire the more confidence in the dowager, and her son Garnash organized and performed a little comedy at Condillac a couple of nights after his appointment as mademoiselle's jailer. He gave an alarm at dead midnight, and when half-clad men, followed presently by Madame and Marian, rushed into the anteroom where he stood, a very picture of the wildest excitement, he drew their attention to two twisted sheets, tied end to end, hanging from the window which overlooked the moat. And in answer to the Marquise's questions, he informed her that he had been disturbed by sounds of movements, and upon entering the chamber, he had discovered Mademoiselle making these preparations for departure. Valerie, locked in the inner chamber, refused to come forth as the Marquise bade her, but her voice reassured Madame de Condillac of her presence, and so, since her attempt had failed, Madame was content to let her be. "The little fool," she said, peering down from the window into the night. "She would have been killed for certain. Her rope of sheets does not reach more than a third of the way down. She would have had over 30 feet to fall, and if that had not been enough to finish her, she would with certainty have been drowned in the moat." She signified her satisfaction with the faithful Batista's vigilance by a present of some gold pieces in the morning, and since the height of the window and the moat beneath it did not appear sufficient obstacles to Mademoiselle's attempts at effecting her escape, the dowager had the window nailed down. Thus, only by breaking could egress be obtained, and the breaking of it could not be effected without such a noise as must arouse Batista. Under Garnach's instructions, the comedy was carried a little further. Mademoiselle affected for her jailer a most unconquerable aversion, and this she took pains to proclaim. One morning, 3 days after her attempted escape, she was taking the air in the garden of Condillac, Batista, ever watchful, a few paces behind her, when suddenly she was joined by Marius, a splendid, graceful figure in a riding suit of brown velvet and biscuit-colored hose, his points tipped with gold, his long boots of finest Maroquin leather, his liver-color hound at his heels. It was the last day of October, but the weather, from cold and wet that it had been for the past fortnight, had taken on a sudden improvement. The sun shone, the air was still and warm, and but for the strewn leaves and the faint smell of decay with which the breath of autumn is ever laden, one might have fancied a day of early spring. It was not Valerie's wont to pause when Marius approached, since she might not prevent him from walking where he listed. She had long since abandoned the futility of bidding him begone when he came near her, but at least she had never stopped in her walk, never altered its pace. She had suffered what she might not avoid, but she had worn the outward air of suffering it with indifference. This morning, however, she made a departure from her long habit. Not only did she pause upon observing his approach, but she called to him as if she would have him hasten to her side. And hasten he did, a new light in his eyes that was mostly a surprise, but a little also of hope. She was gracious to him for once, and gave him good morning in a manner that bordered upon the pleasant. Wondering, he fell into step beside her, and they paced together the yew-bordered terrace, the ever-vigilant but discreet Batista following them, though keeping now a few paces farther in the rear. For a little while they appeared constrained, and their talk was of the falling leaves and the grateful change that had so suddenly come upon the weather. Suddenly she stopped and faced him. "Will you do me a favor, Marius?" she asked. He halted too, and turned to her, studying her gentle face, seeking to guess her mind in the clear hazel eyes she raised to his. His eyebrows lifted slightly with surprise. "Nevertheless, there is in all the world, Valerie, nothing you could ask me that I would not do," he protested. She smiled wistfully. "How easy it is to utter words," she sighed. "Marry me," he answered, leaning towards her, his eyes devouring her now, "and you shall find my words very quickly turn to deeds." "Ah!" said she, and her smile broadened and took on a scornful twist. "You make conditions now. If I will marry you, there is nothing you will not do for me, so that conversely I may take it that if I do not marry you, there is nothing you will do. But in the meantime, Marius, until I resolve me whether I will marry you or not, would you not do a little thing that I might ask of you?" "Until you resolve," he cried, and his face flushed with the sudden hope he gathered from those words. Hitherto there had been no suggestion of a possible modification of attitude towards his suit. It had been repulsion, definite and uncompromising. Again he studied her face. Was she fooling him, this girl with the angel innocence of glance? The thought of such a possibility cooled him instantly. "What is it you want of me?" he asked, his voice ungracious. "Only a little thing, Marius." Her glance traveled back over her shoulder to the tall, limber fellow in leather jerkin and with cross-gartered legs who lounged a dozen steps behind them. "Rid me of that ruffian's company," said she. Marius looked back at Batista, and from him to Valerie. Then he smiled and made a slight movement with his shoulders. "But to what end?" he asked, as one who pleadingly opposes an argument that is unreasonable. Another would replace him, and there is little to choose among the men that garrison Condillac. Little, perhaps, but that little matters. Sure of her ground, and gathering from his tone and manner that the more ardently she begged this thing, the less likely would it be that she should prevail, she pursued her intercessions with a greater heat. "Oh," she cried in a pretended rage, "it is to insult me to give me that unclean knave for perpetual company. I loathe and detest him. The very sight of him is too much to endure." "You exaggerate," said he coldly. "I do not. Indeed, I do not," she rejoined, looking frankly, pleadingly into his face. "You do not realize what it is to suffer the insolent vigilance of such as he, to feel that your every step is under surveillance, to feel his eyes ever upon you when you are within his sight. Oh, it is insufferable." Suddenly he gripped her arm, his face within a hand's breadth of her own, his words falling hot and quickly on her ear. "It is yours to end it when you will, Valerie," he passionately reminded her. "Give yourself into my keeping. Let be mine to watch over you henceforth. Let me—" Abruptly he ceased. She had drawn back her head. Her face was white to the lips, and in her eyes, as they dwelt on his at such close quarters, there appeared a look of terror, of loathing unutterable. He saw it, and releasing her arm, he fell back as if she had struck him. The color left his face too. "Or is it," he muttered thickly, "that I inspire you with much the same feeling as does he?" She stood before him with lowered eyelids, her bosom heaving still from the agitation of fear his closeness had aroused in her. He studied her in silence a moment, with narrowing eyes and tightening lips. Then anger stirred in him, and quenched the sorrow with which at first he had marked the signs of her repulsion. But anger in Marius de Condillac was a cold and deadly emotion that vented itself in no rantings, uttered no loud-voiced threats or denunciations, prompted no waving of arms or plucking forth of weapons. He stooped towards her again from his stately, graceful height. The cruelty hidden in the beautiful lines of his mouth took instant prominence in the smile that flickered round it. "I think that Batista makes a very excellent watchdog," he said, and you would have thought him amused, as if at the foolish subterfuge of some little child. "You may be right to dislike him. He knows no French, so that it may not be yours to pervert and bribe him with promises of what you will do if he assists you to escape. But you will see that this very quality which renders him detestable to you renders him invaluable to us." He laughed softly, as one well pleased with his own astuteness, doffed his hat with a politeness almost exaggerated, and whistling his dog, he abruptly left her. Thus were Marius and his mother, to whom he bore the tale of Valerie's request, tricked further into reposing the very fullest trust in the watchful, incorruptible Batista. Realizing that this would be so, Garnash now applied himself more unreservedly to putting into effect the plans he had been maturing, and he went about it with a zest that knew no flagging, with a relish that nothing could impair. Not that it was other than usual for Garnash to fling himself wholeheartedly into the conduct of any enterprise he might have upon his hands, but he had come into this affair at Condillac against his will. Stress of circumstances it was had driven him on, step by step, to take a personal hand in the actual deliverance of Valerie. It was vanity and pride that had turned him back when already he was on the road to Paris. Not without yet a further struggle would he accept defeat. To this end had he been driven, for the first time in his life, to the indignity of his foul disguise, and he, whose methods had ever been direct, had been forced to have recourse to the commonest of subterfuges. It was with anger in his heart that he had proceeded to play the part he had assumed. He felt it to be a thing unworthy of him, a thing that derogated from his self-respect. Had he but had the justification of some high political aim, he might have endured it with a better resignation. The momentous end to be served might have sanctioned the ignoble means adopted. But here was a task in itself almost as unworthy of him as the methods by which he now set about accomplishing it. He was to black his face and dye his beard and hair, stain his skin and garb himself in filthy rags, for no better end than that he might compass the enlargement of the girl from the captivity into which she had been forced by a designing Lady of Dauphiny. Was that a task to set a soldier, a man of his years and birth and name? He had revolted at it. Yet that stubborn pride of his that would not brook his return to Paris to confess himself defeated by a woman over this woman's business held him relentlessly to his distasteful course. And gradually the distaste of it had melted. It had begun to fall away 5 nights ago, when he had heard what passed between Madame de Condillac and Valerie. A great pity for this girl, a great indignation against those who would account no means too base to achieve their ends with her, a proper realization of the indignities she was suffering, caused him to shed some of his reluctance, some of his sense of injury to himself. His innate chivalry, that fine spirit of his which had ever prompted him to defend the weak against the oppressor, stirred him now, and stirred him to such purpose that, in the end, from taking up the burden of his task reluctantly, he came to bear it zestfully and almost gladly. He was rejoiced to discover himself equipped with histrionic gifts of which he had had no suspicion hitherto, and it delighted him to set them into activity. Now it happened that at Condillac there was a fellow countryman of Batista's, a mercenary from northern Italy, a rascal named Arsenio, whom Fortunio had enlisted when first he began to increase the garrison a month ago. Upon this fellow's honesty Garnash had formed designs. He had closely observed him, and in Arsenio's countenance he thought he detected a sufficiency of villainy to augur well for the prosperity of any scheme of treachery that might be suggested to him provided the reward were adequate. Garnash went about sounding the man with a wheeliness peculiarly his own. Arsenio being his only compatriot at Condillac, it was not wonderful that in his few daily hours of relief from his jailer's duty, Batista should seek out the fellow and sit and talk with him. The pair became intimate, and intercourse between them grew more free and unrestrained. Garnash waited, wishing to risk nothing by precipitancy, and watched for his opportunity. It came on the morrow of All Saints. On that day of the dead, Arsenio, whose rearing had been that of a true son of Mother Church, was stirred by the memory of his earthly mother, who had died some 3 years before. He was silent and moody, and showed little responsiveness to Garnash's jesting humor. Garnash, wondering what might be toward in the fellow's mind, watched him closely. Suddenly the little man, he was a short, bow-legged, sinewy fellow, heaved a great sigh as he plucked idly at a weed that grew between 2 stones of the inner courtyard, where they were seated on the chapel steps. "You are a dull comrade today, compatriot," said Garnash, clapping him on the shoulder. "It is the Day of the Dead," the fellow answered him, as though that were an ample explanation. Garnash laughed. "To those that are dead it no doubt is. So was yesterday. So will tomorrow be. But to us who sit here, it is the day of the living." "You are a scoffer." The other reproached him, and his rascally face was oddly grave. "You don't understand. Enlighten me, then. Convert me. It is the day when our thoughts turn naturally to the dead, and mine are with my mother, who has lain in her grave these 3 years. I am thinking of what she reared me, and of what I am." Garnash made a grimace which the other did not observe. He stared at the little cutthroat, and there was some dismay in his glance. What ailed the rogue? Was he about to repent him of his sins, and have done with villainy and treachery? Was he minded to slit no more gullets in the future, be faithful to the hand that paid him, and lead a godlier life? Peste! That was a thing that would nowise suit Monsieur de Garnash's ends just then. If Arsenio had a mind to reform, let him postpone that reformation until Garnash should have done with him. So he opened his lips and let out a deep guffaw of mockery. "We shall have you turning monk," said he, "a candidate for canonization going barefoot, with flagellated back and shaven head. No more wine, no more dice, no more wenches, no more—" "Peace," snapped the other. "Say pax," suggested Garnash, "pax tecum, or vobiscum. It is thus you will be saying it later. If my conscience pricks me, is it aught to you? Have you no conscience of your own? None. Men wax lean on it in this vale of tears. It is a thing invented by the great to enable them to pursue the grinding and oppression of the small. If your master pays you ill for the dirty work you do for him, and another comes along to offer you some rich reward for an omission in that same service, you are warned that if you let yourself be tempted, your conscience will plague you afterwards. Pish! A clumsy, childish device that, to keep you faithful." Arsenio looked up. Words that defamed the great were ever welcome to him. Arguments that showed him he was oppressed and imposed upon sounded ever gratefully in his ears. He nodded his approval of Batista's dictum. "Body of Bacchus," he swore. "You are right in that, compatriot. But my case is different. I am thinking of the curse that Mother Church has put upon this house. Yesterday was All Saints, and never a mass heard I. Today is All Souls, and never a prayer may I offer up in this place of sin for the rest of my mother's soul." "How so?" quoth Garnash, looking in wonder at this religiously minded cutthroat. "How so? Is not the house of Condillac under excommunication, and every man who stays in of his own free will, prayers and sacraments are alike forbidden here." Garnash received a sudden inspiration. He leapt to his feet, his face convulsed as if at the horror of learning of a hitherto undreamed of state of things. He never paused to give a moment's consideration to the cutthroat's mind, so wonderfully constituted as to enable him to break with impunity every one of the commandments every day of the week for the matter of a louis d'or or two, and yet be afflicted by qualms of conscience at living under a roof upon which the church had hurled her malediction. "What are you saying, compatriot? What is it that you tell me?" "The truth," said Arsenio with a shrug. "Any man who willfully abides in the services of Condillac," and instinctively he lowered his voice lest the captain or the marquis should be within earshot, "is excommunicate." "By the host," swore the false Piedmontese, "I am a Christian man myself, Arsenio, and I have lived in ignorance of this thing. That ignorance may be your excuse. But now that you know," Arsenio shrugged his shoulders, "now that I know, I had best have a care of my soul and look about me for other employment." "Alas," sighed Arsenio, "it is none so easy to find." Garnash looked at him. Garnash began to have his luck a still greater faith than hitherto. He glanced stealthily around. Then he sat down again, so that his mouth was close to Arsenio's ear. "The pay is beggarly here. Yet I have refused a fortune offered me by another that I might remain loyal to my masters at Condillac. But this thing that you tell me alters everything." "By the host." "Yes." "A fortune?" sneered Arsenio. "Aye, a fortune, at least 50 pistoles. That is a fortune to some of us." Arsenio whistled. "Tell me more," said he. Garnash rose with the air of one about to depart. "I must think of it," said he, and he made shift to go. But the other's hand fell with a clenching grip upon his arm. "Of what must you think, fool?" said he. "Tell me this service you have been offered. I have a conscience that upbraids me. If you refuse these 50 pistoles, why should not I profit by your folly? There would not be the need. 2 men are required for the thing I speak of, and there are 50 pistoles for each. If I decide to undertake the task, I'll speak of you as a likely second." He nodded gloomily to his companion, and shaking off his hold, he set out to cross the yard. But Arsenio was after him, and had fastened again upon his arm, detaining him. "You fool," said he. "You'd not refuse his fortune?" "It would mean treachery," whispered Garnash. "That is bad." The other agreed, and his face fell. But remembering what Garnash had said, he was quick to brighten again. "Is it to these folk here at Condillac?" he asked. Garnash nodded. "And they would pay. These people that seek our service would pay you 50 pistoles. They seek my service only as yet. They might seek yours were I to speak for you. And you will, compatriot. You will you not? We are comrades, we are friends, and we are fellow countrymen in a strange land. There is nothing I would not do for you, Batista. Look, I would die for you if there should come the need. Body of Bacchus, I would. I am like that when I love a man." Garnash patted his shoulder. "You are a good fellow, Arsenio. And you will speak for me? But you do not know the nature of the service," said Garnash. "You may refuse it when it is definitely offered you. Refuse 50 pistoles? I should deserve to be the pauper that I am if such had been my habits. Be the service what it may, my conscience pricks me for serving Condillac. Tell me how the 50 pistoles are to be earned, and you may count upon me to put my hand to anything." Garnash was satisfied, but he told Arsenio no more that day, beyond assuring him he would speak for him and let him know upon the morrow. Nor on the morrow, when they returned to the subject at Arsenio's eager demand, did Garnash tell him all, or even that the service was mademoiselle's. Instead, he pretended that it was someone in Grenoble who needed 2 such men as they. "Word has been brought me," he said mysteriously. "You must not ask me how. But how the devil are we to reach Grenoble?" "The captain will never let us go," said Arsenio in an ill humor. "On the night that you are the watch, Arsenio, we will depart together without asking the captain's leave. You shall open the postern when I come to join you here in the courtyard. But what a man at the door yonder? And he jerked his thumb towards a tower where Mademoiselle was a captive, and where at night Batista was locked in with her. At the door leading to the courtyard, a sentry was always posted for greater security. That door and that sentry were obstacles which Garnash saw the futility of attempting to overcome without aid. That was why he'd been forced to enlist Arsenio's assistance. "You must account for him, Arsenio," said he. "Thus?" inquired Arsenio coolly, and he passed the edge of his hand significantly across his throat. Garnash shook his head. "No," said he. "There will be no need for that. A blow over the head will suffice. Besides, it may be quieter. You will find the key of the tower in his belt. When you have felled him, get and unlock the door, then whistle for me. The rest will be easy. You are sure he has a key? I have it from Madame herself." They were forced to leave it with him to provide for emergencies. Mademoiselle's attempted escape by the window showed them the necessity for it. He did not add that it was the implicit confidence they reposed in Batista himself that had overcome their reluctance to leave the key with the sentry. To seal the bargain, and in earnest of all the gold to come, Garnash gave Arsenio a couple of gold louis as a loan to be repaid him when their nameless employer should pay him his 50 pistoles in Grenoble. The sight and touch of the gold convinced Arsenio that the thing was no dream. He told Garnash that he believed he would be on guard duty on the night of the following Wednesday. This was Friday, and so for Wednesday next they left the execution of their plans unless, meantime, a change would be effected in the disposition of the sentries. Chapter 13. The courier, Monsieur de Garnash, was pleased with the issue of his little affair with Arsenio. "Mademoiselle," he told Valerie that evening, "I was right to have faith in my luck, right to believe that the tide of it is flowing. All we need now is a little patience. Everything has become easy." It was the hour of supper. Valerie was at table in her anteroom, and Batista was in attendance. It was an added duty they had imposed upon him, for, since her attempt to escape, Mademoiselle's imprisonment had been rendered more rigorous than ever. No servant of the chateau was allowed past the door of the outer anteroom, now commonly spoken of as the garden of the tower. Valerie dined daily in the salon with Madame de Condillac and Marius, but her other meals were served her in her own apartments. The servants who brought the meals from the kitchen delivered them to Batista in the guardroom, and he it was who laid the cloth and waited upon Mademoiselle. At first this added duty had irritated him more than all that he had so far endured. Had he, Martin Marie Rigobert de Garnash, lived to discharge the duties of a lackey, to bear dishes to a lady's table and to remain at hand to serve her, the very thought had all but set him in a rage. But presently he grew reconciled to it. It afforded him particular opportunities of being in Mademoiselle's presence and of conferring with her, and for the sake of such an advantage he might well belittle the unsavory part of the affair. A half-dozen candles burned in 2 gleaming silver sconces on the table. In her tall-backed leather chair Mademoiselle sat and ate and drank but little, while Garnash told her the preparations he had made. "If my luck but holds until Wednesday next," he concluded, "you may count upon being well out of Condillac. Arsenio does not dream that you come with us, so that even should he change his mind, at least we have no cause to fear betrayal. But he will not change his mind. The prospect of 50 pistoles has rendered it immutable." She looked up at him with eyes brightened by hope and by the encouragement to count upon success which she gathered from his optimism. "You have contrived it marvelously well," she praised him. "If we succeed—" "Say, when we succeed, mademoiselle," he laughingly corrected her. "Very well, then, when we shall have succeeded in leaving Condillac, whither am I to go?" "Why, with me to Paris, as was determined. My man awaits me at Voiron with money and horses. No further obstacle shall rise to hamper us once our backs are turned upon the ugly walls of Condillac. The Queen shall make you welcome and keep you safe until Monsieur Florimond comes to claim his bride." She sipped her wine, then set down the glass and leaned her elbow on the table, taking her chin in her fine white hand. "Madame tells me that he is dead," said she, and Garnash was shocked at the comparative calmness with which she said it. He looked at her sharply from under his soot brows. Was she, after all, he wondered, no different from other women? Was she cold and calculating? And had she as little heart as he had come to believe was usual with her sex, that she could contemplate so calmly the possibility of her lover being dead? He had thought her better, more natural, more large-hearted, and more pure. That had encouraged him to stand by her in these straits of hers, no matter at what loss of dignity to himself. It began to seem that his conclusions had been wrong. His silence caused her to look up, and in his face she read something of what was passing in his thoughts. She smiled rather wanly. "You are thinking me heartless, Monsieur de Garnache? I am thinking you womanly. The same thing, then, to your mind. Tell me, monsieur, do you know much of women?" "God forbid. I have found trouble enough in my life." "And you pass judgment thus upon a sex with which you have no acquaintance." "Not by acquaintance only is it that we come to knowledge. There are ways of learning other than by the road of experience. One may learn of dangers by watching others perish. It is the fool who will be satisfied alone with the knowledge that comes to him from what he undergoes himself." "You are very wise, monsieur," said she demurely, so demurely that he suspected her of laughing at him. "You were never wed?" "Never, mademoiselle," he answered stiffly, "nor ever in any danger of it." "Must you, indeed, account a danger?" "A deadly peril, mademoiselle," said he, whereupon they both laughed. She pushed back her chair and rose slowly. Slowly she passed from the table and stepped towards a window. Turning, she set her back to it and faced him. "Monsieur de Garnache," said she, "you are a good man, a true and noble gentleman. I would that you thought a little better of us. All women are not contemptible. Believe me, I will pray that you may yet mate with one who will prove to you the truth of what I say." He smiled gently and shook his head. "My child," said he, "I am not half the noble fellow you account me. I have a stubborn pride that stands me at times in the stead of virtue. It was pride brought me back here. For instance, I could not brook the laughter that would greet me in Paris did I confess that I was beaten by the Dowager of Condillac. I tell you this to the end that, thinking less well of me, you may spare me prayers which I should dread to see fulfilled. I have told you before, mademoiselle, heaven is likely to answer the prayers of such a heart as yours. Yet, but a moment back you deemed me heartless," she reminded him. "You seemed so indifferent to the fate of Florimond de Condillac." "I must have seemed then what I am not," she told him, "for I am far from indifferent to Florimond's fate. The truth is, monsieur, I do not believe Madame de Condillac. Knowing me to be under a promise that naught can prevail upon me to break, she would have me believe that nature has dissolved the obligation for me. She thinks that were I persuaded of Florimond's death, I might turn an ear to the wooing of Marius. But she is mistaken, utterly mistaken, and so I sought to convince her. My father willed that I should wed Florimond. Florimond's father had been his dearest friend. I promised him that I would do his will, and by that promise I am bound. But were Florimond indeed dead, and were I free to choose, I should not choose Marius, were he the only man in all the world." Garnache moved nearer to her. "You speak," said he, "as if you were indifferent in the matter of wedding Florimond, whilst I understand that your letter to the Queen professed you eager for the alliance. I may be impertinent, but frankly your attitude puzzles me." "I am not indifferent," she answered him, but calmly, without enthusiasm. "Florimond and I were playmates, and as a little child I loved him and admired him as I might have loved and admired a brother perhaps. He is comely, honorable, and true. I believe he would be the kindest husband ever woman had, and so I am content to give my life into his keeping. What more could be needed?" "Never ask me, mademoiselle. I am by no means an authority," said he, "but you appear to have been well schooled in a most excellent philosophy." And he laughed outright. She reddened under his amusement. "It was thus my father taught me," said she in quieter tones, "and he was the wisest man I ever knew, just as he was the noblest and the bravest." Garnache bowed his head. "God rest his soul," said he with respectful fervor. "Amen," the girl replied, and they fell silent. Presently she returned to the subject of her betrothed. "If Florimond is living, this prolonged absence, this lack of news is very strange. It is 3 months since last we heard of him. 4 months, indeed. Yet he must have been apprised of his father's death, and that should have occasioned his return." "Was he indeed apprised of it?" inquired Garnache. "Did you yourself communicate the news to him?" "Aye," she cried. "But no, monsieur. We do not correspond." "That is a pity," said Garnache, "for I believe that the knowledge of the Marquis's death was kept from him by his stepmother." "Mon Dieu!" she exclaimed in horror. "Do you mean that he may still be in ignorance of it?" Not that. A month ago, a courier was dispatched to him by the Queen Mother. The last news of him, some 4 months old, as you said, reported him at Milan in the service of Spain. Thither was a courier sent to find him and to deliver him letters setting forth what was toward at Condillac. A month ago, she said, and still we have no word. I am full of fears for him, monsieur. And I, said Garnash, am full of hope that we shall have news of him at any moment. That he was well justified of his hope was to be proven before they were many days older. Meanwhile, Garnash continued to play his part of jailer to the entire satisfaction and increased confidence of the Condillacs. What time he waited patiently for the appointed night, when it should be his friend Arsenio's turn to take the guard. On that fateful Wednesday, Batista sought out, as had now become his invariable custom, his compatriot as soon as the time of his noontide rest was come, the hour at which they dined at Condillac. He found Arsenio sunning himself in the outer courtyard, for it seemed that year that as the winter approached the warmth increased. Never could man remember such a St. Martin summer as was this. In so far as the matter of their impending flight was concerned, Batista was as brief as he could be. "Is all well?" he asked. "Shall you be on guard tonight?" "Yes. It is my watch from sunset till dawn. At what hour shall we be stirring?" Garnash pondered a moment, stroking that firm chin of his, on which the erstwhile stubble had now grown into a straggling, unkempt beard, and it plagued him not a little, for a close observer might have discovered that it was of a lighter color at the roots. His hair, too, was beginning to lose its glossy blackness. It was turning dull, and presently, no doubt, it would begin to pale, so that it was high time he spread his wings and took flight from Condillac. We had best wait until midnight. It will give them time to be soundly in their slumbers. Though, should there be signs of any one stirring even then, you had better wait till later. It were foolish to risk having our going prevented for the sake of leaving a half-hour earlier. "Depend upon me," Arsenio answered him. "When I open the door of your tower, I shall whistle to you. The key of the postern hangs on the guardroom wall. I shall possess myself of that before I come." "Good," said Garnash. "We understand each other." And on that they might have parted there and then, but that there happened in that moment a commotion at the gate. Men hurried from the guardhouse, and Fortunio's voice sounded loud in command. A horseman had galloped up to Condillac, walked his horse across the bridge, which was raised only at night, and was knocking with the butt of his whip an imperative summons upon the timbers of the gate. By Fortunio's orders it was opened, and a man covered with dust, astride a weary, foam-flecked horse, rode under the archway of the keep into first courtyard of the chateau. Garnash eyed him in surprise and inquiry, and he read in the man's appearance that he was a courier. The horseman had halted within a few paces of the spot where Batista and his companion stood, and seeing in the vilely clad Garnash a member of the Condillac household, he flung him his reins, then got down stiffly from his horse. Fortunio, bristling with importance, his left hand on the hilt of his rapier, the fingers of his right twirling at his long, fair mustachios, at once confronted him and craved his business. "I am the bearer of letters from Madame the Dowager Marquise de Condillac," was the reply. Whereupon, with an arrogant nod, Fortunio bade the fellow go with him, and issued an order that his horse should be cared for. Arsenio was speaking in Garnash's ear. The man's nature was inquisitive, and he was indulging idle conjectures as to what might be the news this courier brought. Garnash's mind, actuated by very different motives, was engaged upon the same task, so much so that not a word heard he of what his supposed compatriot was whispering. Whence came this courier? Why had not that fool Fortunio asked him, so that Garnash might have overheard his answer? Was he from Paris and the Queen, or was he, perchance, from Italy and Florimond? These were questions to which it imported him to have the answers. He must know what letters the fellow brought. The knowledge might guide him now, might even cause him to alter the plans he had formed. He stood in thought whilst, unheeded by him, Arsenio prattled at his elbow. He bethought him of the old minstrel's gallery at the end of the hall, in which the Condillacs were dining, and whither the courier would be conducted. He knew the way to that gallery, for he had made a very close study of the chateau against the time when he might find himself in need of the knowledge. With a hurried excuse to Arsenio, he moved away, and, looking round to see that he was unobserved, he was on the point of making his way to the gallery, when suddenly he checked himself. What went he there to do? To play the spy? To become fellow to the lackey who listens at keyholes? Ah, no. That was something no service could demand of him. He might owe a duty to the queen, but there was also a duty that he owed himself, and this duty forbade him from going to such extremes. Thus spake his pride, and he mistook its voice for that of honor. Betide what might, it was not for Garnash to play the eavesdropper. Not that, parj. And so he turned away, his desires in conflict with that pride of his, and gloomily he paced the courtyard, Arsenio marveling what might have come to him. And well was it for him that pride should have detained him. Well would it seem as if his luck were indeed in the ascendant, and had prompted his pride to save him from a deadly peril. For suddenly someone called Batista, he heard, but for the moment, absorbed as he was in his own musings, he overlooked the fact that it was the name to which he answered at Condillac. Not until it was repeated more loudly and imperatively did he turn to see Fortunio beckoning him. With a sudden dread anxiety, he stepped to the captain's side. Was he discovered? But Fortunio's words set his doubts to rest at once. You are to reconduct Mademoiselle de la Vauvray to her apartments at once. Garnash bowed and followed the captain up the steps and into the chateau that he might carry out the order, and as he went he shrewdly guessed that it was the arrival of that courier had occasioned the sudden removal of Mademoiselle. When they were alone together, he and she, in her anteroom in the northern tower, she turned to him before he had time to question her, as he was intending. "A courier has arrived," said she. "I know. I saw him in the courtyard. Whence is he? Did you learn it?" "From Florimond." She was white with agitation. "From the Marquis de Condillac?" he cried, and he knew not whether to hope or fear. "From Italy?" "No, monsieur. I do not think from Italy. From what was said, I gathered that Florimond is already on his way to Condillac." Oh, it made a fine stir. It left them no more appetite for dinner, and they seemed to have thought it could have left me none for mine, for they ordered my instant return to my apartments. "Then you know nothing, save that the courier is from the Marquis?" "Nothing. Nor am I likely to," she answered, and her arms dropped limply to her sides. Her eyes looked entreatingly up into his gloomy face. But Garnash could do no more than rap out an oath. Then he stood still a moment, his eyes on the window, his chin in his hand, brooding. His pride and his desire to know more of that courier's message were fighting it out again in his mind, just as they fought it out in the courtyard below. Suddenly his glance fell on her, standing there, so sweet, so frail, and so disconsolate. For her sake, he must do the thing. Repulsive though it might be, "I must know more," he exclaimed. "I must learn Florimond's whereabouts, if only that we may go to meet him when we leave Condillac tonight." "You have arranged definitely for that?" she asked, her face lighting. "All is in readiness," he assured her. Then, lowering his voice without apparent reason, and speaking quickly and intently, "I must go find out what I can," he said. "There may be a risk, but it is as nothing to the risk we run of blundering matters through ignorance of what may be afoot. Should anyone come, which is unlikely, for all those interested will be in the hall until courier is dealt with, and should they inquire into my absence, you are to know nothing of it, since you have no Italian and I no French. All that you will know will be that you believe I went but a moment since to fetch water. You understand?" She nodded. "Then lock yourself in your chamber till I return." He caught up a large earthenware vessel in which water was kept for his own and Mademoiselle's use, emptied it through the guard-room window into the moat below, then left the room and made his way down the steps to the courtyard. He peered out. Not a soul was in sight. This inner courtyard was little tenanted at that time of day, and the sentry at the door of the tower was only placed there at nightfall. Alongside this there stood another door, opening into a passage from which access might be gained to any part of the chateau. Thrusting behind that door the earthenware vessel that he carried, Garnash sped swiftly down the corridor on his eavesdropping errand. Still his mind was in conflict. At times he cursed his slowness, at times his haste and readiness to undertake so dirty a business, wishing all women at the devil, since by the work of women was he put to such a shift as this. Chapter 14. Florimond's Letter. In the great hall of Condillac, where the Marquise, her son, and Mademoiselle La Vauvray had been at dinner, a sudden confusion had been spread by the arrival of that courier so soon as it was known that he bore letters from Florimond, Marquis de Condillac. Madame had risen hastily, fear and defiance blending in her face, and she had at once commanded Mademoiselle's withdrawal. Valerie had wondered might there not be letters, or leastways messages, for herself from her betrothed. But her pride had suppressed the eager question that welled up to her lips. She would, too, have questioned the courier concerning Florimond's health. She would have asked him how the Marquis looked, and where the messenger had left him. But of all this that she craved to know, nothing could she bring herself to ask before the Marquise. She rose in silence upon hearing the dowager order Fortunio to summon Battista, that he might reconduct Mademoiselle to her apartments, and she moved a few paces down the hall, toward the door, in proud, submissive readiness to depart. Yet she could not keep her eyes from the dust-stained courier, who, having flung his hat and whip upon the floor, was now opening his wallet, the dowager standing before him to receive his papers. Marius, affecting an insouciance he did not feel, remained at table, his page behind his chair, his hound stretched at his feet, and he now sipped his wine, now held it to the light that he might observe the beauty of its deep red color. At last Fortunio returned, and Mademoiselle took her departure, head in the air and outwardly seeming nowise concerned in what was taking place. With her went Fortunio, and the Marquise, who now held the package she had received from the courier, bade the page depart also. When the three were at last alone, she paused before opening the letter and turned again to the messenger. She made a brave figure in the flood of sunlight that poured through the gules and azures of the long blazing windows, her tall, lissom figure clad in a close-fitting robe of black velvet, her abundant, glossy black hair rolled back under a white coif, her black eyes and scarlet lips detaching from the ivory of her face, in which no trace of emotion showed, for all the anxiety that consumed her. "Where left you the Marquis de Condillac?" she asked the fellow. "At La Rochette, madam." The courier answered, and his answer brought Marius to his feet with an oath. "So near," he cried out. But the dowager's glance remained calm and untroubled. "How does it happen that he did not hasten himself to Condillac?" she asked. "I do not know, madam. I did not see Monsieur le Marquis. It was his servant brought me that letter with orders to ride hither." Marius approached his mother, his brow clouded. "Let us see what he says," he suggested anxiously. But his mother did not heed him. She stood balancing the package in her hand. "Can you tell us, then, nothing of Monsieur le Marquis?" "Nothing more than I have told you, madam." She bade Marius call Fortunio, and then dismissed the courier, bidding her captain see to his refreshment. Then, alone at last with her son, she hastily tore the covering from the letter, unfolded it, and read. And Marius, moved by anxiety, came to stand beside and just behind her, where he too might read. The letter ran, "My very dear Marquise, I do not doubt but that it will pleasure you to hear that I am on my way home, and that but for a touch of fever that has detained us here at La Rochette, I should be at Condillac as soon as the messenger who is the bearer of these presents. A courier from Paris found me a fortnight since in Milan, with a letter setting forth that my father had been dead 6 months, and that it was considered expedient at court that I should return home forthwith to assume the administration of Condillac. I am lost in wonder that a communication of this nature should have been addressed to me from Paris instead of from you, as surely it must have been your duty to advise me of my father's decease at the time of that untoward event. I am cast down by grief at this evil news, and the summons from court has brought me in all haste from Milan. The lack of news from Condillac has been for months a matter of surprise to me. My father's death may be some explanation of this, but scarcely explanation enough. However, madam, I count upon it that you will be able to dispel such doubts as I am fostering. I count, too, upon being at Condillac by the end of the week, but I beg that neither you nor my dear Marius will allow this circumstance to make any difference to yourselves, just as, although I am returning to assume the government of Condillac as the court has suggested to me, I hope that yourself and my dear brother will continue to make it your home for as long as it shall pleasure you. So long shall it pleasure me. I am, my dear Marquise, your very humble and very affectionate servant and stepson, Florimond. When she had read to the end, the dowager turned back and read aloud the passage. However, madam, I count upon it that you will be able to dispel such doubts as I am fostering. She looked at her son, who had shifted his position, so that he was now confronting her. He has his suspicions that all is not as it should be, sneered Marius. Yet his tone is amiable throughout. It cannot be that they said too much in that letter from Paris. A little trill of bitter laughter escaped her, We are to continue to make this our home, for as long as it shall pleasure us, so long shall it pleasure him. Then, with a sudden seriousness, she folded the letter and, putting her hand behind her, looked up into her son's face. "Well," she asked, "what are you going to do?" "Strange that he makes no mention of Valerie," said Marius pensively. "Pooh! A Condillac thinks lightly of his women. What are you going to do?" His handsome countenance, so marvelously like her own, was overcast. He looked gloomily at his mother for a moment. Then, with a slight twitch of the shoulders, he turned and moved past her slowly in the direction of the hearth. He leaned his elbow on the overmantel and rested his brow against his clenched right hand, and stood so a while in moody thought. She watched him, a frown between her arrogant eyes. "I ponder it," said she. "He is at La Rochette within a day's ride, and only detained there by a touch of fever. In any case, he promises to be here by the end of the week. By Saturday, then, Condillac will have passed out of our power. It will be lost to you irretrievably. Will you lose La Vouvray as well?" He let his hand fall to his side and turned, fully to face her. "What can I do?" "What can we do?" he asked, a shade of petulance in his question. She stepped close up to him and rested her hand lightly upon his shoulder. "You have had 3 months in which to woo that girl, and you have tarried sadly over it, Marius. You have now at most 3 days in which to accomplish it. What will you do?" "I have been maladroit, perhaps," he said with bitterness. "I have been overpatient with her. I have counted too much upon the chance of Florimond's being dead, as seen from the utter lack of news of him. Yet what could I do? Carry her off by force and compel at the dagger's point some priest to marry us?" She moved her hand from his shoulder and smiled, as if she derided him and his heat. "You want for invention, Marius," said she, "and yet I beg that you will exert your mind, or Sunday next shall find us well nigh homeless. I'll take no charity from the Marquis de Condillac, nor, I think, will you?" "If all fails," said he, "we have still your house in Touraine." "My house?" she echoed, her voice shrill with scorn. "My hovel, you would say. Could you abide there in such a sty? Vertud you? If all else failed, we might be glad of it." "Glad of it? Not I, for one. Yet all else will fail unless you bestir yourself in the next 3 days. Condillac is as good as lost to you already, since Florimond is upon the threshold. La Vouvray most certainly will be lost to you as well, unless you make haste to snatch it in the little moment that is left you." "Can I achieve the impossible, madam?" he cried, and his impatience waxed beneath this unreasonable insistence of his mother's. "Who asks it of you? Do not you, madam?" "I? Pish! All that I urge is that you take Valerie across the border into Savoy, where you can find a priest to marry you, and get it done this side of Saturday. And is not that impossible? She will not go with me, as you well know, madam." There was a moment's silence. The dowager shot him a glance. Then her eyes fell. Her bosom stirred as if some strange excitement moved her. Fear and shame were her emotions. For a way she knew by which mademoiselle might be induced to go with him, not only willingly, but eagerly, she thought, to the altar. But she was his mother, and even her harsh nature shuddered before the task of instructing him in this vile thing. Why had the fool not wit enough to see it for himself? Observing her silence, Marius smiled sardonically. "You may well ponder it," said he. "It is an easy matter to tell me what I should do. Tell me, rather, how it should be done." His blindness stirred her anger, and her anger whelmed her hesitation. "Were I in your place, Marius, I should find a way," said she, in a voice utterly expressionless, her eyes averted ever from his own. He scanned her curiously. Her agitation was plain to him, and it puzzled him, as did the downcast glance of eyes usually so bold and insolent in their gaze. Then he pondered her tone, so laden with expression by its very expressionlessness, and suddenly a flood of light broke upon his mind, revealing very clearly and hideously her meaning. He caught his breath with a sudden gasp and blenched a little. Then his lips tightened suddenly. "In that case, madam," he said, after a pause, and speaking as if he were still without revelation of her meaning, "I can but regret that you are not in my place. For as it is, I am thinking we shall have to make the best of the hovel in Touraine." She bit her lip in the intensity of her chagrin and shame. She was no fool, nor did she imagine from his words that her meaning had been lost upon him. She knew that he had understood, and that he chose to pretend that he had not. She looked up suddenly, her dark eyes blazing, a splash of color in either cheek. "Fool!" she snapped at him. "You lily-livered fool! Are you indeed my son? Are you, by God, that you talk so lightly of yielding?" She advanced a step in his direction. "Through your cowardice you may be content to spend your days in beggary. Not so am I, nor shall I be, so long as I have an arm and a voice. You may go hence if your courage fails you outright, but I'll throw up the bridge and entrench myself within these walls. Florimond de Condillac sets no foot in here while I live, and if he should come within range of musket shot, it will be the worse for him. I think you are mad, madam. Mad so to talk of resisting him, as you are mad to call me coward. I'll leave you till you are come to a more tranquil frame of mind." And turning upon his heel, his face on fire from the lash of her contempt, he strode down the hall and passed out, leaving her alone. White again, with heaving bosom and clenched hands, she stood a moment where he had left her, then dropped into a chair, and taking her chin in her hand, she rested her elbow on her knee. Thus she remained, the firelight tinting her perfect profile, on which little might be read of the storm that was raging in her soul. Another woman in her place would have sought relief in tears, but tears came rarely to the beautiful eyes of the Marquise de Condillac. She sat there until the sun had passed from the windows behind her, and the corners of the room were lost in the quickening shadows. At last she was disturbed by the entrance of a lackey, who announced that Monsieur le Comte de Trécen, Lord Seneschal of Dauphiny, was come to Condillac. She bade the fellow call help to clear the board, where still was set their interrupted noontide meal, and then to admit the seneschal. With her back to the stirring, bustling servant she stood, pensively regarding the flames, and a smile that was mocking rather than aught else spread upon her face. If all else failed her, she told herself, there would be no Touraine hovel for her. She could always be Comtesse de Trécen. Let Marius work out alone the punishment of his cowardice. Away in the northern tower, where Mademoiselle was lodged, she sat in eager talk with Garnache, who had returned unobserved and successful from his journey of espionage. He had told her what from the conversation of Marius and his mother he had learned touching the contents of that letter. Florimond lay as near as La Rochette, detained there by a touch of fever, but promising to be at Condillac by the end of the week. Since that was so, Valerie opined there was no longer need to put themselves to the trouble of the escape they had planned. Let them wait until Florimond came. But Garnache shook his head. He had heard more, and for all that he accounted her at present safe from Marius, yet he made no false estimate of that supple gentleman's character, was not deluded by his momentary show of niceness. As the time of Florimond's arrival grew nearer, he thought it very possible that Marius might be rendered desperate. There was grave danger in remaining. He said naught of this, yet he convinced Mademoiselle that it were best to go, though there will no longer be the need of a toilsome journey as far as Paris, he concluded. A 4 hours' ride to La Rochette, and you may embrace your betrothed. Did he speak of me in his letter? Know you, monsieur? She inquired. I heard them say that he did not, Garnache replied, but it may well be that he had good reason. He may suspect more than he has written. In that case, she asked, and there was a wounded note in her voice, why should a touch of fever keep him at La Rochette? Would a touch of fever keep you from the woman you loved, monsieur, if you knew or even suspected that she was in durance? I do not know, mademoiselle. I am an old man who has never loved, and so it would be unfair of me to pass judgment upon lovers, that they think not as other folk is notorious. Their minds are for the time disordered. Nevertheless, he looked at her where she sat by the window, so gentle, so lissom, so sweet, and so frail, and yet a shrewd notion that were he Florimond de Condillac, whether he feared her endurance or not the fever, nor the plague itself should keep him for the best part of a week at La Rochette within easy ride of her. She smiled gently at his words, and turned the conversation to the matter that imported most. Tonight, then, it is determined that we are to go at midnight or a little after. Be in readiness, mademoiselle, and do not keep me waiting when I rap upon your door. Haste may be of importance. You may count upon me, my friend, she answered him, and stirred by a sudden impulse, she held out her hand. You have been very good to me, Monsieur de Garnache. You have made life very different for me since your coming. I had it in my mind to blame you once for your rashness in returning alone. I was a little fool. You can never know the peace that has come to me from having you at hand. The fears, the terrors that possessed me before you came have all been dispelled in this last week that you have been my sentry in two senses." He took the hand she held out to him and looked down at her out of his grimy, disfigured face, an odd tenderness stirring him. He felt as might have felt a father towards his daughter. At least, so thought he then. "Child," he answered her, "you overrate it. I have done no less than I could do, no more than any other would have done. Yet more than Florimond has done, and he my betrothed. A touch of fever was excuse enough to keep him at La Rochette, whilst the peril of death did not suffice to deter you from coming hither. You forget, mademoiselle, that maybe he does not know your circumstances." "Maybe he does not," said she with a half-sigh. Then she looked up into his face again. "I am sad at the thought of going, monsieur," she surprised him by saying. "Sad!" he cried. Then he laughed. "But what can there be to sadden you?" "This, monsieur, that after tonight it is odds I shall never see you more." She said it without hesitation and without coquetry, for her upbringing had been simple and natural in an atmosphere different far from that in which had been reared the courtly women he had known. "You will return to Paris and the great world, and I shall live out my life in this little corner of Dauphiny. You will forget me in the bustle of your career, monsieur, but I shall always hold your memory very dear and very gratefully. You are the only friend I have ever known since my father died, excepting Florimond, though it is so long since I have seen him, and he never came to me in times of stress as you have done." "Mademoiselle," he answered, touched despite himself more touched than he could have believed possible to his callous, world-worn nature. "You make me very proud. You make me feel a little better than I am, for if I have earned your regard and friendship, there must be some good in old Garnash. Believe me, mademoiselle, I too shall not forget." And thereafter they remained a spell in silence. She sitting by the window, gazing out into the bright October sky. He standing by her chair, thoughtfully considering her brown head so gracefully set upon her little shoulders. A feeling came to him that was odd and unusual. He sought to interpret it, and he supposed it to mean that he wished that at some time in the dim past he might have married some woman who would have borne him for daughter such a one as this. Chapter 15. The conference. The matter that brought Monsieur de Trace and de Condillac, and brought him in most fearful haste, was the matter of the courier who had that day arrived at the chateau. News of it had reached the ears of my Lord Seneschal. His mind had been a prey to uneasiness concerning this business of rebellion in which he had so rashly lent a hand, and he was anxious to know whence came this courier and what news he brought. But for all his haste he had paused, remembering it was a marquise he went to visit, to don the gorgeous yellow suit with the hanging sleeves which he had from Paris, and the crimson sash he had bought at Tailman's, all in the very latest mode. Thus arrayed, his wig well curled and a clump of it caught in ribbon of flame-colored silk on the left side, his sword hanging from belt, and carriages richly wrought with gold, and the general courtier-like effect rather marred by the heavy riding boots which you would like to leave behind yet were constrained to wear, he presented himself before the dowager, hiding his anxiety in a melting smile, and the latter in the profoundest of bows. The graciousness of his reception overwhelmed him almost, for in his supreme vanity he lacked the wit to see that this cordiality might be dictated by no more than the need they had of him at Condillac. A lackey placed a great chair for him by the fire that he might warm himself after his evening ride, and the dowager, having ordered lights, sat herself opposite him with the hearth between them. He simpered a while and toyed with trivialities of speech before he gave utterance to the matter that absorbed him. Then, at last, when they were alone, he loosed a question that was bubbling on his lips. "I hear a courier came to Condillac today." For answer she told him what he sought to learn, whence came that courier and what the message that he brought. "And so, Monsieur de Trace, and," she ended, "my days at Condillac are numbered." "Why so?" he asked, "since you say that Florimond has adopted towards you a friendly tone. Surely he would not drive his father's widow hence." She smiled at the fire in a dreamy, pensive manner. "No," said she, "he would not drive me hence. He has offered me the shelter of Condillac for as long as it may pleasure me to make it my home." "Excellent!" he exclaimed, rubbing his little fat hands and screwing the little features of his huge red face into the grotesque semblance of a smile. "What need to talk of going, then?" "What need?" she echoed, in a voice dull and concentrated. Do you ask that, Trace-san? Do you think I should elect to live upon the charity of this man? For all that the Lord Seneschal may have been dull-witted, yet he had wit enough to penetrate to the very marrow of her meaning. You must hate Florimond very bitterly, said he. She shrugged her shoulders. I possess, I think, the faculty of feeling strongly. I can love well, monsieur, and I can hate well. It is one or the other with me. And as cordially as I love my own son Marius, as cordially do I detest this coxcomb Florimond. She expressed no reason for her hatred of her late husband's elder son. Hers were not reasons that could easily be put into words. They were little reasons, trivial grains of offense which through long years had accumulated into a mountain. They had their beginning in the foolish grievance that had its birth with her own son, when she had realized that but for that rosy-cheeked, well-grown boy born to the Marquis by his first wife, Marius would have been heir to Condillac. Her love of her own child and her ambitions for him, her keen desire to see him fill an exalted position in the world, caused her 1,000 times a day to wish his half-brother dead. Yet Florimond had flourished and grown, and as he grew he manifested a character which, with all its imperfections, was more lovable than the nature of her own offspring. And their common father had never seen aught but the faults of Marius and the virtues of Florimond. She had resented this, and Marius had resented it. And Marius, having inherited with his mother's beauty his mother's arrogant, dominant spirit, had returned with insolence such admonitions as from time to time his father gave him, and thus the breach had grown. Later, since he could not be heir to Condillac, the Marquise's eyes, greedy of advancement for him, had fallen covetously upon the richer La Vouvray, whose lord had then no son, whose heiress was a little girl, by an alliance easy to compass. Since the lords of Condillac and La Vouvray were lifelong friends, Marius's fortunes might handsomely have been mended. Yet when she herself bore the suggestion of it to the Marquis, he had seized upon it, approved it, but adopted it for Florimond's benefit instead. Thereafter war had raged fiercely in the family of Condillac, a war between the Marquis and Florimond on the one side, and the Marquise and Marius on the other. And so bitterly was it waged that it was by the old Marquis's suggestion that at last Florimond had gone upon his travels to see the world and carry arms in foreign service. Her hopes that he would take his death, as was a common thing when warring, rose high, so high as to become almost assurance, a thing to be reckoned with. Florimond would return no more, and her son should fill the place to which he was entitled by his beauty of person and the high mental gifts his doting mother saw in him. Yet the months grew into years, and at long intervals full of hope for the Marquis, news came of Florimond, and the news was ever that he was well and thriving, gathering honors and drinking deep of life. And now, at last, when matters seemed to have been tumbled into her lap, that she might dispose of them as she listed, now, when in her anxiety to see her son supplant his stepbrother in the possession of La Vouvray, if not, perhaps, in that Condillac as well she had done a rashness which might end in making her and Marius outlaws. News came that this hated Florimond was at the door, tardily returned, yet returned in time to overthrow her schemes and to make her son the pauper that her husbands will had seemed to aim at rendering him. Her mind skimmed lightly over all these matters, seeking somewhere some wrong that should stand out stark and glaring, upon which she might seize, and offer to the seneschal as an explanation of her hatred. But nowhere could she find the thing she sought. Her hatred had for foundation a material too impalpable to be fashioned into words. Tresson's voice aroused her from her thoughts. "Have you laid no plans, madam?" he asked her. It were surely a madness now to attempt to withstand the Marquis. The Marquis? Ah, yes, Florimond. She sat forward out of the shadows in which her great chair enveloped her, and let candle and firelight play about the matchless beauty of her perfect face. There was a flush upon it, the flush of battle, and she was about to tell the seneschal that not while one stone of Condillac should stand upon another, not while a gasp of breath remained in her frail body, would she surrender, but she checked her rashness. Well, might it be that in the end she should abandon such a purpose? Trayson was ugly as a toad, the most absurd, ridiculous bridegroom that ever led woman to the altar. Yet rumor ran that he was rich, and as a last resource, for the sake of his possession, she might bring herself to endure his signal shortcomings. "I have taken no resolve as yet," said she in a wistful voice. "I founded hopes upon Marius, which Marius threatens to frustrate. I think I had best resign myself to the poverty of my Touraine home. And then the seneschal realized that the time was now. The opportunity he might have sought in vain was almost thrust upon him. In the spirit, he blessed Florimond for returning so opportunely. In the flesh, he rose from the chair and, without more ado, he cast himself upon his knees before the dowager. He cast himself down, and the dowager experienced a faint stirring of surprise that she heard no flop, such as must attend the violent falling of so fat a body. But the next instant, realizing the purpose of his absurd posture, she shrank back with a faint gasp, and her face was mercifully blurred to his sight once more amid the shadows of her chair. Thus was he spared the look of utter loathing, of unconquerable, irrepressible disgust that leapt into her countenance. His voice quivered with ridiculous emotion. His little fat red fingers trembled as he outheld him in a theatrical gesture of supplication. "Never contemplate poverty, madam, until you have discarded me," he implored her. "Say but that you will, and you shall be Lady of Tresan. All that I would prove but poor adornment to a beauty such as yours, and I should shrink from offering it you, were it not that, with it all, I can offer you the fondest heart in France. Marquise, Clotilde, I cast myself humbly at your feet. Do with me as you will. I love you." By an effort she crushed down her loathing of him, a loathing that grew 100-fold as she beheld him now transformed by his amorousness into the semblance almost of satyr, and listened to his foolish rantings. As Marquise de Condillac had hurt her pride to listen and not have him whipped for his audacity. As a woman it insulted her, yet the Marquise and the woman she alike repressed. She would give him no answer. She could not. So near was she fainting with disdain of him. Yet must she give him hope against the time when, should all else fail, she might have to swallow the bitter draught he was now holding to her lips. So she temporized. She controlled her voice into a tone of gentle sadness. She set a mask of sorrow upon her insolent face. "Monsieur, monsieur," she sighed, and so far overcame her nausea as for an instant to touch his hand in a little gesture of caress. "You must not speak so to a widow of 6 months, nor must I listen." The quivering grew in his hands and voice, but no longer did they shake through fear of a rebuff. They trembled now in the eager strength of the hope he gathered from her words. She was so beautiful, so peerless, so noble, so proud, and he so utterly unworthy, that naught but her plight had given him courage to utter his proposal. And she answered him in such terms. "You give me hope, Marquise? If I come again—" She sighed, and her face, which was once more within the light, showed a look of sad inquiry. "If I thought that what you have said out of pity, because you fear lest my necessity should hurt me, I could give you no hope at all. I have my pride, mon ami. But if what you have said you would still have said though I continued mistress of Condillac, then, Tresan, you may repeat it to me hereafter, at a season when I may listen." His joy welled up and overflowed in him, as overflows a river in time of spate. He bent forward, caught her hand, and bore it to his lips. "Clotilde!" he cried, in a smothered voice. Then the door opened, and Marius stepped into the long chamber. At the creaking sound of the opening door, the seneschal bestirred himself to rise. Even the very young care not so to be surprised. How much less, then, a man well past the prime of life? He came up laboriously, the more laboriously by virtue of his very efforts to show himself still nimble in his mistress's eyes. Upon the intruder, he turned a crimson, furious face, perspiration gleaming like varnish on brow and nose. At sight of Marius, who stood arrested, scowling villainously upon the pair, the fire died suddenly from his glance. "Ah, my dear Marius," said he, with a flourish and an air of being mightily at his ease. But the young man's eyes went over and beyond him to rest in a look of scrutiny upon his mother. She had risen too, and he had been in time to see the startled manner of her rising. In her cheeks there was a guilty flush, but her eyes boldly met and threw back her son's regard. Marius came slowly down the room, and no word was spoken. The seneschal cleared his throat with noisy nervousness. Madame stood hand on hip, the flush fading slowly, her glance resuming its habitual lazy insolence. By the fire Marius paused and kicked the logs into a blaze, regardless of the delicate fabric of his rosette shoes. "Monsieur le Seneschal," said Madame calmly, "came to see us in the matter of the courier." "Ah!" said Marius, with an insolent lifting of his brows and a sidelong look at Tresan, and Trayson registered in his heart a vow that when he should come to wed the mother, he would not forget to take payment for that glance from her pert son. Monsieur le Comte will remain and sup with us before riding back to Grenoble, she added. Ah, said he again in the same tone. And that for the moment was all he said. He remained by the fire, standing between them where he had planted himself in the flesh, as if to symbolize the attitude he intended in the spirit. But one chance he had, before supper was laid, of a word alone with his mother, in her own closet. Madam, he said, his sternness mingling with alarm, are you mad that you encouraged the suit of this hedgehog Trayson? She looked him up and down with a deliberate eye, her lip curling a little. Surely, Marius, it is my own concern. Not so, he answered her, and his grasp fastened almost viciously on her wrist. I think that it is mine as well. Mother, bethink you, and his tone changed in imploring key. Bethink you what you would do. Would you mate with such a thing as that? His emphasis of the pronoun was very eloquent. Not in all the words of the French language could he have told her better how high he placed her in his thoughts, how utterly she must fall, how unutterably be soiled by an alliance with Trayson. I had hoped you would have saved me from it, Marius, she answered him, her eyes seeming to gaze down into the depths of his. At La Vouvray, I had hoped to live out my widowhood in tranquil dignity. But she let her arms fall sharply to her sides and uttered a little sneering laugh. But, mother, he cried, between the dignity of La Vouvray and the indignity of Trayson, surely there is some middle course? Aye, she answered scornfully, starvation on a dunghill in Touraine, or something near akin to it, for which I have no stomach. He released her wrist and stood with bent head, clenching and unclenching his long white hands, and she watched him, watching it in the working of his proud and stubborn spirit. Mother, he cried at last, and the words sounded absurd between them. By so little did he seem the younger of the twain. Mother, you shall not do it, you must not. You leave me little alternative. Alas, sighed she, had you been more adroit you had been wed by now, Marius, and the future would give us no concern. As it is, Florimond comes home and we— She spread her hands and thrust out her nether lip in a grimace that was almost ugly. Then, come, she said briskly, supper is laid, and my lord seneschal will be awaiting us. And before he could reply, she had swept past him and taken her way below. He followed gloomily, and in gloom sat he at table, never heeding the reckless gaiety of the seneschal and the forced mirth of the marquise. He well understood the sort of tacit bargain that his mother had made with him. She had seen her advantage in his loathing of the proposed union with Trayson, and she had used it to the full. Either he must compel Valerie to wed him this side of Saturday, or resign himself to see his mother, his beautiful, peerless mother, married to the skin of lard that called itself a man. Living, he had never entertained for his father's son's respect, nor, dead, did he now reverence his memory as become son. But in that hour, as he sat at table, facing this gross woo of his mother's, his eyes were raised to the portrait of the florid-visaged, haughty Marquis de Condillac, where it looked down upon him from the panelled wall. And from his soul, he offered up to that portrait of his dead sire an apology for the successor whom his widow destined him. He ate little, but drank great draughts, as men will when their mood is sullen and dejected, and the heat of the wine, warming his veins and lifting from him some of the gloom that had settled over him, lent him anon a certain recklessness very different from the manner of his sober moments. Chancing suddenly to raise his eyes from the cup into which he had been gazing, absorbed his gaze as a seer into his crystal, he caught on the seneschal's lips so odious a smile, and the man's eyes so greedy, hateful a leer as he bent them on the Marquise, that he had much ado not to alter the expression of that flabby face by hurling at it the cup he held. He curbed himself. He smiled sardonically upon the pair, and in that moment he swore that be the cost what it might, he would frustrate the union of those two. His thoughts flew to Valerie, and the road they took was foul with the mud of ugly deeds. A despair, grim at first, then mocking, took possession of him. He loved Valerie to distraction, loved her for herself, apart from all worldly advantages that must accrue to him from an alliance with her. His mother saw in that projected marriage no more than the acquisition of the lands of La Vouvray, and she may even have thought that he himself saw no more, in that she was wrong. But because of it she may have been justified of her impatience with him at the tardiness, the very clumsiness with which he urged the suit. How was she to know that it was just the sincerity of his passion made him clumsy? For like many another, normally glib, self-assured, and graceful, Marius grew halting, shy, and clumsy only where he loved. But in the despair that took him, now the quality of his passion seemed to change. Partly it was the wine, partly the sight of this other lover, of whom there must be an end, whose very glance seemed to him an insult to his mother. His imagination had taken fire that night, and it had ripened him for any villainy. The seneschal and the wine between them had opened the floodgates of all that was evil in his nature, and that evil thundered out in a great torrent that bid fair to sweep all before it. And suddenly, unexpectedly for the others, who were by now resigned to his moody silence, the evil found expression. The Marquise had spoken of something of slight importance. That must be done before Florimond returned. Abruptly Marius swung round in his seat to face his mother. "Must this Florimond return?" he asked, and for all that he uttered no more words. So ample in their expression were those that he had uttered and the tone of them, that his meaning left little work to the imagination. Madame turned to stare at him, surprise ineffable in her glance. Not at the thing that he suggested, but the abruptness with which the suggestion came. The cynical, sneering tone rang in her ears after the words were spoken, and she looked at his face for a confirmation of their full purport. She observed the wine flush on his cheek, the wine glitter in his eye, and she remarked the slight smile on his lips and the cynical assumption of nonchalance with which he fingered the jewel in his ear as he returned her gaze. She beheld now in her son a man more purposeful than she had ever known before. A tense silence had followed his words, and the Lord Seneschal gaped at him, some of the color fading from his plethoric countenance, suspecting as he did the true drift of Marius's suggestion. At last it was Madame who spoke, very softly, with a narrowing of the eyes. "Call Fortunio," was all she said, but Marius understood full well the purpose for which he would have Fortunio called. With a half-smile he rose, and going to the door, he bade his page, who was idling in the anteroom, go summon the captain. Then he paced slowly back, not to the place he had lately occupied at table, but to the hearth, where he took his stand with his shoulders square to the overmantel. Fortunio came, fair-haired and fresh-complexioned as a babe, his supple, not ungraceful figure tawdrily clad in showy clothes of poor material the worse for hard usage and spilt wine. The Countess bade him sit, and with her own hand she poured a cup of anjou for him, in some wonder, and, for all his ordinary self-possession, with a little awkwardness, the captain did her bidding, and with an apologetic air he took the seat she offered him. He drank this wine, and here was a spell of silence till Marius, grown impatient, brutally put the thing for which the Marquise sought delicate words. "We have sent for you, Fortunio," said he, in a blustering tone, "to inquire of you what price you'd ask to cut the throat of my brother, the Marquis de Condillac." The seneschal sank back in his chair with a gasp. The captain, a frown between his frank-seeming, wide-set eyes, started round to look at the boy. The business was by no means too strong for the ruffler's stomach, but the words in which it was conveyed to him most emphatically were. "Monsieur de Condillac," said he, with an odd assumption of dignity, "I think you have mistaken your man. I am a soldier, not a cutthroat. But yes," the Marquise soothed him, throwing herself instantly into the breach, and laying a long, slender hand upon the frayed green velvet of the captain's sleeve. "What my son means and what he says are vastly different things." "It will sorely tax your wits, madam," laughed Marius brutally, "to make clear that difference." And then the seneschal nervously cleared his throat, and muttering that it waxed late, and he must be riding home, made shift to rise. Him, too, the Marquise at once subdued. She was not minded that he should go just yet. It might be useful to her hereafter to have had him present at this conference, into which she meant to draw him, until she should have made him one with them, a party to their guilt. For the task she needed not over many words, just one or two and a melting glance or so, and the rebellion in his bosom was quelled at once. But with the captain her wiles were not so readily successful. He had no hopes of winning her to wife, happily no desire, since he was not a man of very great ambitions. On the other hand, he had against him the very worst record in France, and for all that he might embark upon this business under the auspices of the Lord Seneschal himself, he knew not how far the Lord Seneschal might dare to go thereafter to save him from a hanging, should it come to that. He said as much in words. In a business of this kind, he knew from experience The more difficulties he advanced, the better a bargain he drove in the end. And if he was to be persuaded to risk his neck in this, he should want good payment. But even for good payment on this occasion, he was none too sure, as yet, that he would let himself be persuaded. Monsieur Fortunio, the Marquis said very softly, heed not Monsieur Marius's words. Attend to me. The Marquis de Condillac, as no doubt you will learn for yourself, is lying at La Richette. Now it happens that he is noxious to us. Let the reasons be what they may. We need a friend to put him out of our way. Will you be that friend? You will observe, sneered Marius, how wide a difference there is between what the Marquis suggests and my own frank question of what price you would take to cut my brother's throat. I observe no difference, which is what you would say. Fortunio answered truculently, his head well back, his brown eyes resentful of offense. For none could be so resentful of imputed villainy as your villain who is thorough-paced. And, he concluded, I return you the same answer, madam, that I am no cutthroat. She repressed her anger at Marius's sneering interference, and made a little gesture of dismay with her eloquent white hands. But we do not ask you to cut a throat. I have heard amiss then, said he, his insolence abating nothing. You have heard aright, but you have understood amiss. There are other ways of doing these things. If it were but the cutting of a throat, should we have sent for you? There are a dozen in the garrison would suffice for our purpose. What is it, then, you need? Quoth he. We want an affair contrived with all decency. The Marquis is at the Seigneur Noir at La Richette. You can have no difficulty in finding him, and having found him, less difficulty still in giving or provoking insult. Excellent, murmured Marius from the background. It is such an enterprise as should please a ready swordsman of your caliber, Fortunio. A duel, quoth the fellow, and his insolence went out at him, thrust out by sheer dismay. His mouth fell open. A duel was another affair altogether. But, sang you, what if he should slay me? Have you thought of that? Slay you? Cried the Marquise, her eyes resting on his face with an expression as of wonder at such a question. You jest, Fortunio? And he with the fever, put in Marius, sneering. Ah, muttered Fortunio. He has a fever? The fever is something. But, accidents will happen. Florimond was ever an indifferent swordsman, murmured Marius dreamily, as if communing with himself. The captain wheeled upon him once more. Why, then, Monsieur Marius, said he, since that is so, and you are skilled as am I or more, and he has a fever, where is the need to hire me to the task? Where? Echoed Marius. What affair may that be of yours? We ask you to name a price on which you will do this thing. Have done with counter-questions. Marius was skilled with the foils, as Fortunio said, but he cared not for unbaited steel, and he was conscious of it, so that the captain's half-sneer had touched him on the raw. But he was foolish to take that tone in answer. There was a truculent, southern pride in the ruffler which sprang immediately into life, and which naught that they could say thereafter would stamp out. Must I say again that you mistake your man? Was his retort. And as he spoke he rose, as though to signify that the subject wearied him, and that his remaining pursuit must be idle. I am not of those to whom you can say, I need such a one killed. Name me the price at which you'll be his butcher. The Marquise wrung her hands in pretty mimicry of despair, and poured out soothing words, as one might pour oil upon stormy waters. The seneschal sat in stolid silence, a half-scared spectator of this odd scene. What time the Marquise talked and talked until she brought Fortunio back to some measure of subjection. Such reasoning as she made use of she climaxed by an offer of no less a sum than 100 pistoles. The captain licked his lips and pulled at his mustachios, for all his vaunted scorn of being a butcher at a price. Now that he heard the price, he seemed not half so scornful. Tell me again the thing that you need doing and the manner of it, said he, as one who was moved to reconsider. She told him, and when she had done, he made a compromise. If I go upon this business, madam, I go not alone. Oh, as for that, said Marius, it shall be as you will. Take what men you want with you, and hang with them afterwards, maybe, he sneered, his insolence returning. The 100 pistoles would avail me little then. Look you, Monsieur de Condillac, and you, madam, if I go, I'll need to take with me a better hostage than the whole garrison of this place. I'll need for shield someone who will see to it that he has not hurt himself, just as I shall see to it that he is hurt before I am." "What do you mean?" "Speak out, Fortunio," the Marquise bade him. "I mean, madam, that I will go, not to do this thing, but to stand by and render help if help be needed. Let Monsieur de Condillac go, and I will go with him, and I will undertake to see to it that he returns unhurt and that we leave the other stark." Both started, and the seneschal leaned heavily upon the table. He was not, with all his faults, a man of blood, and this talk of butchery turned him sick and faint. Vainly now did the Marquise seek to alter the captain's resolution, but in this she received a sudden check from Marius himself. He cut in upon her arguments to ask the captain, "How can you promise so much? Do you mean that you and I must fall upon him? You forget that he will have men about him. A duel is one thing, a rough and tumble another, and we shall fare none so well in this, I'm thinking." The captain closed one eye, and a leer of subtle cunning overspread his face. "I've thought of that," said he. "Neither a duel nor a rough and tumble do I propose, but something between the two, something that shall seem a duel yet be a rough and tumble." "Explain yourself." "What further explanation does it ask? We come upon Monsieur le Marquis where his men are not. We penetrate, let us say, into his chamber. I turn the key in the door. We are alone with him, and you provoke him. He is angry and must fight you there and then. I am your friend. I must fill the office of second for both sides. You engage, and I stand aside and let you fight it out. You say he is indifferently skilled with the sword, and, in addition, that he has a fever. Thus you should contrive to put your steel through him, and a duel it will have been. But if by luck or skill he should have you in danger, I shall be a hand to flick in my sword at the right moment, and make an opening through which you may send yours home." "Believe me, it were better," began the dowager. But Marius, who of a sudden was much taken with the notion, again broke in. "Are you to be depended upon to make no mistake? Fortunio?" "Perbacco," swore the ruffler. "A mistake must cost me 100 pistoles. I think you may depend upon me there. If I err at all, it will be on the side of eagerness to see you make short work of him. You have my answer now, monsieur. If we talk all night, you shall not move me further. But if my proposal suits you, I am your man." "And I yours, Fortunio," answered Marius, and there was a ring almost of exultation in his voice. The dowager looked from one to the other, as if she were weighing the men, and satisfied herself that Marius ran no risk. She put a question or two to her son, another to the captain. Then, seeming satisfied with what had been agreed, she nodded her head and told them they had best be stirring with the dawn. "You will have light enough by 6:30. Do not delay later in taking the road, and see that you are back here by nightfall. I shall be anxious till you are returned." She poured wine again for the captain, and Marius, coming up to the table, filled himself a glass, which he tossed off. The Marquise was speaking to Trésan. "Will you not drink to the success of the venture?" she asked him, in a coaxing tone, her eyes upon his own. "I think we are like to see the end of our troubles now, monsieur, and Marius shall be lord both of Condillac and La Vouvray." And the gross, foolish seneschal, under the spell of her magnificent eyes, slowly raised his cup to his lips and drank to the success of that murderous business. Marius stood still, a frown between his eyes, haled thither by the mention of La Vouvray. He might be winning it, as his mother said, but he would prefer to have won it differently. Then the frown was smoothed away. A sardonic smile replaced it. Another cup of wine he poured himself. Then, without word to any there, he turned on his heel and went from the room, a trifle unsteady in his gait, yet with such lines of purposefulness in the way he bore himself that the three of them stared after him in dull surprise. Chapter 16. The Unexpected. In her apartments in the northern tower, Valerie had supped, and, to spare Monsieur de Garnache the full indignity of that part of the offices he was charged with, she had herself remove the cloth and set the things in the guard-room, where they might lie till morning. When that was done, and despite her protests, Garnache had insisted upon lending a hand. The Parisian reminded her that it was already after 9, and urged her to make such preparations as incumbed her for their journey. "My preparations are soon made," she assured him with a smile. "I need but what I may carry in a cloak." They fell to talking of their impending flight, and they laughed together at the discomfiture that would be the dowager's and her son's when, in the morning, they came to discover the empty cage. From that they passed on to talk of Valerie herself, of her earlier life at La Vouvray, and later the conversation shifted to Garnash, and she questioned him touching the warring he had seen in early youth, and afterwards asked him for particulars of Paris, that wonderful city which to her mind was the only earthly parallel of paradise and of the life at court. Thus in intimate talk did they while away the time of waiting, and in the hour that sped they came, perhaps, to know more of each other than they had done hitherto. Intimate, indeed, had they unconsciously become already. Their singular position, locked together in that tower, a position utterly impossible under any but the conditions that attended it, had conduced to that good fellowship, whilst the girl's trust and dependence upon the man's observance of that trust, and his determination to show her that it had not been misplaced, had done the rest. But tonight they seemed to have drawn nearer in spirit to each other, and that maybe it was that prompted Valerie to sigh, and in her sweet, unthinking innocence to say again, "I am truly sorry, Monsieur de Garnache, that our sojourn here is coming to an end." He was no coxcomb, and he set no false value on the words. He laughed for answer as he rejoined, "Not so am I, mademoiselle, nor shall I know peace of mind again until this ill-omened chateau is a good 3 leagues or so behind us. S.H., what was that?" He came instantly to his feet, his face intent and serious. He had been sitting at his ease in an armchair, over the back of which he had tossed the baldric from which his sword depended. The clang of the heavy door below, striking the wall as it was pushed open, had reached his ears. "Can it be time already?" asked mademoiselle. Yet a panic took her, and she blenched a little. He shook his head. "Impossible," said he. "It is not more than 10 o'clock. Unless that fool Arsenio has blundered." He stopped. "S.H.," he whispered, "someone is coming here." And suddenly he realized the peril that might lie in being found thus in her company. It alarmed him more than did the visit itself. So unusual at this hour. He saw that he had not time to reach the guardroom. He would be caught in the act of coming forth, and that might be interpreted by the dowager or her son, if it should happen to be one or the other of them, as a hurried act of flight, such as guilt might prompt. Perhaps he exaggerated the risk. But their fortunes at Condillac had reached a point where they must not be jeopardized by any chance, however slight. "To your chamber, mademoiselle," he whispered fearfully, and he pointed to the door of the inner room. "Lock yourself in. Quick! S.H." And he signed frantically to her to go silently. Swift and quietly as a mouse, she glided from the room and softly closed the door of her chamber and turned the key in a lock, which Garnash had had the foresight to keep well oiled. He breathed more freely when it was done. A step sounded in the guardroom. He sank without a rustle into the chair from which he had risen, rested his head against the back of it, closed his eyes, opened his mouth, and dissembled sleep. The steps came swiftly across the guardroom floor, soft, as of one lightly shod, and Garnash wondered was it the mother or the son, just as he wondered what this ill-come visitor might be seeking. The door of the antechamber was pushed gently open. It stood ajar, and under the lintel appeared the slender figure of Marius, still in his brown velvet suit as Garnash last had seen him. He paused a moment to peer into the chamber. Then he stepped forward, frowning to behold Batista so cozily ensconced. "Over there," he cried, and kicked the sentry's outstretched legs, the more speedily to wake him. "Is this the watch you keep?" Garnash opened his eyes and stared a second dully at the disturber of his feigned slumbers. Then, as if being more fully awakened, he recognized his master. He heaved himself suddenly to his feet and bowed. "Is this the watch you keep?" quoth Marius again, and Garnash, scanning the youth's face with foolishly smiling eyes, noted the flush on his cheek, the odd glitter in his handsome eyes, and even caught a whiff of wine upon his breath. Alarm grew in Garnash's mind, but his face maintained its foolish vacancy, its inane smile. He bowed again, and, with a wave of the hands towards the inner chamber, "La damigella la," said he. For all that Marius had no Italian, he understood the drift of the words, assisted as they were by the man's expressive gesture. He sneered cruelly. "It would be an ugly thing for you, my ugly friend, if she were not," he answered. "Away with you. I shall call you when I need you." And he pointed to the door. Garnash experienced some dismay, some fear even. He plied his wits, and he determined that he had best seem to apprehend from his gestures Marius's meaning, but apprehended in part only, and go no further than the other side of that door. He bowed, therefore, for the third time, and with another of his foolish grins, he shuffled out of the chamber, pulling the door after him, so that Marius should not see how near at hand he stayed. Marius, without further heeding him, stepped to Mademoiselle's door and rapped on a panel with brisk knuckles. "Who is there?" she inquired from within. "It is I, Marius. Open. I have something I must say to you. Will it not keep till morning?" "I shall be gone by then," he answered impatiently, "and much depends upon my seeing you ere I go. So open. Come." There followed a pause, and Garnash in the outer room set his teeth and prayed she might not anger Marius. He must be handled skillfully, lest their flight should be frustrated at the last moment. He prayed, too, that there might be no need for his intervention. That would indeed be the end of all, a shipwreck within sight of harbor. He promised himself that he would not lightly intervene. For the rest, this news of Marius's intended departure filled him with a desire to know something of the journey on which he was bound. Slowly Mademoiselle's door opened. White and timid she appeared. "What do you want, Marius?" "Now and always and above all things the sight of you, Valerie," said he, and the flushed cheek, the glittering eye, and wine-laden breath were as plain to her as they had been to Garnash, and they filled her with a deeper terror. Nevertheless she came forth at his bidding. "I see that you are not yet Abed," said he. "It is as well. We must have a talk." He set a chair for her and begged her to be seated. Then he perched himself on the table, his hands gripping the edges of it on either side of him, and he turned his eyes upon her. "Valerie," he said slowly, "the Marquis de Condillac, my brother, is at La Rochette." "He is coming home," she cried, clasping her hands and feigning surprise in word and glance. Marius shook his head and smiled grimly. "No," said he is not coming home. That is, not unless you wish it. Not unless I wish it? But naturally I wish it. Then, Valerie, if you would have what you wish, so must I. If Florimond is ever to come to Condillac again, you must be my wife." He leaned towards her now, supported by his elbow, so that his face was close to hers, a deeper flush upon it, a brighter glitter in his black eyes, his vinous breath enveloping and suffocating her. She shrank back, her hands locking themselves one in the other till the knuckles showed white. What is it you mean?" she faltered. "No more than I have said, no less, if you love him well enough to sacrifice yourself." And his lips curled sardonically at the word. "Then marry me and save him from his doom." "What doom?" Her voice came mechanically, her lips seeming scarce to move. He swung down from the table and stood before her. "I will tell you," he said, in a voice very full of promise. "I love you, Valerie, above all else on earth, or, I think, in heaven, and I'll not yield you to him. Say no to me now, and at daybreak I start for La Rochette to win you from him at point of sword." Despite her fears, she could not repress a little smile of scorn. "Is that all?" said she. "Why, if you're so rash, it is yourself assuredly will be slain." He smiled tranquilly at that reflection upon his courage and his skill. "So might it befall if I went alone," said he. She understood. Her eyes dilated with horror, with loathing of him. The angry words that sprang to her lips were not to be denied. "You cur, you cowardly assassin," she blazed at him. "I might have guessed that in some such cutthroat manner would your vaunt of winning me at the sword point be accomplished." She watched the color fade from his cheeks, and the ugly, livid hue that spread in his room to his very lips. Yet it did not daunt her. She was on her feet, confronting him ere he had time to speak again. Her eyes flashed, and her arm pointed quivering to the door. "Go," she bade him, her voice harsh for once. "Out of my sight. Go. Do your worst, so that you leave me. I'll hold no traffic with you." "Will you not?" said he, through setting teeth, and suddenly he caught the wrist of that outstretched arm. But she saw nothing of immediate danger. The only danger that she knew was the danger that threatened Florimond, and little did that matter, since at midnight she was to leave Condillac to reach La Rochette in time to warn her betrothed. The knowledge gave her confidence and an added courage. "You have offered me your bargain," she told him. "You have named your price, and you have heard my refusal. Now go." "Not yet a while," said he, in a voice so odiously sweet that Garnash caught his breath. He drew her towards him. Despite her wild struggles, he held her fast against his breast. Do what she would, he rained his hot kisses on her face and hair, till at last, freeing a hand, she smote him with all her might across the face. He let her go then. He fell back with an oath, a patch of finger marks showing red on his white countenance. That blow has killed Florimond de Condillac, he told her viciously. He dies at noon tomorrow. Ponder it, my pretty. I care not what you do so that you leave me, she answered defiantly, restraining by a brave effort the tears of angry distress that welled up from her stricken heart. And no less stricken, no less angry was Garnash where he listened. It was by an effort that he had restrained himself from bursting in upon them when Marius had seized her. The reflection that were he to do so, all would irretrievably be ruin alone had stayed him. Marius eyed the girl a moment, his face distorted by the rage that was in him. By God, he swore, if I cannot have your love, I'll give you cause enough to hate me. Already have you done that most thoroughly, said she. And Garnash cursed this pertness of hers, which was serving to dare him on. The next moment there broke from her a startled cry. Marius had seized her again and was crushing her frail body in his arms. I shall kiss your lips before I go, ma mère, said he, his voice thick now with a passion that was not all of anger. And then, while he still struggled to have his way with her, a pair of arms took him about the waist like hoops of steel. In his surprise, he let her free, and in that moment he was swung back and round and cast a good 6 paces down the room. He came to a standstill by the table, at which he clutched to save himself from falling, and turned bewildered, furious eyes upon Baptista, by whom he now dimly realized that he had been assailed. Garnash's senses had all left him in that moment when Valerie had cried out. He cast discretion to the winds. Reason went out of him, and only blind anger remained to drive him into immediate action. And as suddenly as that flood of rage had leaped, as suddenly did it ebb now that he found himself face to face with the outraged Condillac and began to understand the magnitude of the folly he had committed. Everything was lost now, utterly and irretrievably. Lost as a dozen other fine prizes had been by a sudden and ungoverned frenzy. God, what a fool he was! What a cursed, driveling fool! What, after all, was a kiss or two, compared with all the evil that might now result from his interference? Haply Marius would have taken them and departed, and at midnight they would have been free to go from Condillac. The future would not have been lacking in opportunities to seek out and kill Marius for that insult. Why could he not have left the matter to the future? But now, with Florimond to be murdered on the morrow at La Rochette, himself likely to be murdered within the hour at Condillac, Valerie was at their mercy utterly. Wildly and vainly did he strive even then to cover up the foolish thing that he had done. He bowed apologetically to Marius. He waved his hands and filled the air with Italian phrases, frenziedly uttered, as if by the very vigor of them he sought to drive explanation into his master's brain. Marius watched and listened, but his rage nowise abated. It grew instead, as if that farrago of a language he did not understand were but an added insult. An oath was all he uttered. Then he swung round and caught Garnash's sword in the chair beside him, where it still rested, and Garnash in that moment cursed the oversight. Whipping the long, keen blade from its sheath, Marius bore down upon the rash meddler. Pardieu, he swore between his teeth, we'll see the color of your dirty blood, you that lay hands upon a gentleman. But before he could send home the weapon, before Garnash could move to defend himself, Valerie had slipped between them. Marius looked into her white, determined face, and was smitten with surprise. What was this hind to her, that she should interfere at the risk of taking the sword herself? Then a slow smile spread upon his face. He was smarting still under her disdain and resistance, as well as under a certain sense of the discomfiture this fellow had put upon him. He saw a way to hurt her, to abase her pride, and cut her to the very soul with shame. You are singularly concerned in this man's life, said he, an odious undercurrent of meaning in his voice. I would not have you murder him, she answered, for doing no more than madam your mother bade him. I make no doubt he has proved a very excellent guard, he sneered. Even now, all might have been well. With that insult, Marius might consider that he had taken payment for the discomfiture he had suffered. He might have bethought him that, perhaps, as she said, Baptista had done no more than observe the orders he had received, a trifle excessively, maybe, yet faithfully nevertheless. Thinking thus, He might even have been content to go his ways and take his fill of vengeance by slaying Florimond upon the morrow. But Garnash's rash temper, rising anew, tore that last flimsy chance to shreds. The insult that Mademoiselle might overlook, might even not have fully understood, set him afire with indignation for her sake. He forgot his role, forgot even that he had no French. "Mademoiselle," he cried, and she gasped in her affright at this ruinous indiscretion. "I beg that you will stand aside." His voice was low and threatening, but his words were woefully distinct. "Par la mort Dieu," swore Marius, taken utterly aback. "What may your name be? You hitherto have had no French." Almost thrusting Mademoiselle aside, Garnash stood out to face him, the flush of hot anger showing through the dye on his cheeks. "My name," said he, "is Martin Marie Rigobert de Garnash, and my business now make an end of one at least of this obscene brood of Condillac." And, without more ado, he caught up a chair and held it before him in readiness to receive the other's onslaught. But Marius hung back an instant, at first in sheer surprise, later in fear. He had some knowledge of the fellow's methods. Even the sword he wielded gave him little confidence, opposed to Garnash with chair. He must have help. His eyes sought the door, measuring the distance. Ere he could reach it, Garnash would cut him off. There was nothing for it but to attempt to drive the Parisian back. And so with a sudden rush, he advanced to the attack. Garnash fell back and raised his chair, and in that instant Mademoiselle once more intervened between them. "Stand aside, Mademoiselle," cried Garnash, who now, grown cool, as was his way when once he was engaged, saw clearly through the purpose formed by Marius. "Stand aside, or we shall have him giving the alarm." He leapt clear of her to stop Marius's sudden rush for the door. On the very threshold, the young man was forced to turn and defend himself, lest his brains be dashed out by that ponderous weapon Garnash was handling with a rare facility. But the mischief was done in that he had reached the threshold. Backing, he defended himself and gained the anteroom. Garnash followed, but the clumsy chair was defensive rather than offensive, and Marius's sword meanwhile darted above it and below it, forcing him to keep a certain distance. And now Marius raised his voice and shouted with all the power of his lungs. To me, Fortunio, Abden, to me, you dogs, I am beset." From the courtyard below rose an echo of his words, repeated in a shout by the sentinel, who had overheard them, and they caught the swift fall of the fellow's feet as he ran for help. Furious, picturing to himself how the alarm would spread like a conflagration to the chateau, cursing his headstrong folly, yet determined that Marius at least should not escape him, Garnash put forth his energies to hinder him from gaining the door that opened onto the stairs. From the doorway of the antechamber, Mademoiselle, with a white face and terrified eyes, watched the unequal combat and heard the shouts for help. Anon despair might whelm her at the thought of how they had lost their opportunity of escaping. But for the present she had no thought save for the life of that brave man who was defending himself with an unwieldy chair. Garnash leapt suddenly aside to take his opponent in the flank, and thus turn him from his backward progress towards the outer door. The maneuver succeeded, and gradually, always defending himself, Garnash circled farther round him until he was between Marius and the threshold. And now there came a sound of running feet on the uneven stones of the courtyard. Light gleamed on the staircase, and breathless voices were wafted up to the two men. Garnash bethought him that his last hour was assuredly at hand. Well, if he must take his death, he might as well take it here upon Marius's sword as upon another's. So he would risk it for sake of leaving upon Marius some token by which he might remember him. He swung his chair aloft, uncovering himself for a second. The young man's sword darted in like a shaft of light. Nimbly Garnash stepped aside to avoid it and moved nearer his opponent. Down crashed the chair, and down went Marius, stunned and bleeding under its terrific blow. The sword clattered from his hand and rolled, with a pendulum-like movement, to the feet of Garnash. The Parisian flung aside his chair and stooped to seize that very welcome blade. He rose, grasping the hilt and gathering confidence from the touch of that excellently balanced weapon, and he swung round even as Fortunio and two of his braves appeared in the doorway.